I only needed shelter, but that silent bird seemed to be waiting for me.
She was 19 and hunted. No lease, no supper, no clean place to sleep. Just her mother's blue pillbox and $8 she had kept folded inside the torn lining of her coat. And with that $8 she bought a forgotten automaton maker's room above a limestone alley in Eureka Springs, Carroll County, Arkansas, where the place had fallen off county maps in 1987. The west sill had rotted until rain came through sideways. The back wall leaned 3 inches away from its own studs. The county had condemned it since 2006 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the mahogany pedestal of a life-sized singing bird automaton in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years was $55,000 and a set of lost music rolls that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elin Mara Bell had been listening her whole life without knowing it. She listened before she had words for it, before she understood that every house had a note and every person carried a hidden rhythm beneath the plain business of breathing. In the narrow rental rooms of her childhood, where the pipes knocked behind the plaster after midnight, and the refrigerator shuddered like a tired animal, she could tell when a storm was coming by, the way the window glass tightened in its frame. She could tell when her mother was trying not to cry by the careful silence of a spoon placed in a sink. They moved often, though never far enough to call it a new beginning. There was always a cheaper side street, another room with one brown water stain on the ceiling, another landlord who said the furnace worked if you knew how to coax it. Elin learned the geography of low rent the way other children learned state capitals. She knew which staircases groaned at the third tread, which laundromats kept one working chair by the vending machine, which churches set out canned peaches on Wednesday evenings without asking too many questions. Her mother, Lenora Bell, worked wherever the town left a place open for a woman with a soft voice and hands that had become older than the rest of her. She cleaned exam rooms at a clinic in Pine Bluff, folded towels at a motel off Highway 65, counted returned bottles behind a market that smelled of rain-soaked cardboard. She had once sung in a church choir, people said, and her voice had been clear enough to make strangers turn in their pews. By the time Elin was 10, that voice had narrowed to a low hum under the breath, mostly while washing dishes or searching for a missing receipt. Elin's father was not a villain in the manner of storybooks. He was not large in memory. He had been a travelling machinist named Paul Merritt, a man with square fingernails and a good winter coat who could fix a lawnmower by listening to it once. He stayed until Elin was 4, left a cigar box of dull screws and 2 postcards from Texarkana, then slipped out of their lives in pieces until there was nothing left but his last name on a clinic form crossed out in her mother's handwriting. Lenora never cursed him. She did not praise him either. When Elin asked her mother, only wiped the table twice in the same place and said, "Some people are built with doors where windows ought to be." That was the nearest thing to bitterness she ever allowed herself. The person who gave Elin a steadier world was her mother's uncle, August Bell, who lived in a low green house behind the railroad spur in Conway. He was not old to himself, though everyone else called him that, and he had the careful posture of a man who had spent his life bending over delicate things without breaking them. His hair stood up in white tufts above both ears. His glasses were patched at the hinge with black thread. On his kitchen wall hung 3 clocks, each set to a different time, because, he said, one ought never trust a single clock to tell the whole truth. Every second Saturday, if Lenora could spare the bus fare, Elin was sent to him with a paper sack lunch and instructions not to bother him while he worked. August always pretended this was possible. He would open the back door before she knocked, wearing the same brown apron powdered with brass dust, and he would say, "There now, the shop has been impatient." His shop was a converted washroom no wider than a church aisle, with shelves rising to the ceiling and little drawers labelled in a script so exact it seemed to have been written by a watch: comb blanks, governors, pin wire, cylinder stock, star wheels, bird bellows. The words were ordinary to him and mysterious to everyone else. On the centre bench lay a velvet pad, a set of Swiss files, a bow drill, a burnisher, 2 calipers, and a brass cylinder no longer than a child's wrist, its surface pricked with tiny holes waiting to be filled. August repaired music boxes, though he never said it that plainly. He said he set lost songs back into their bodies. People brought him what they had found in attics and estate trunks: cracked rosewood boxes, tarnished combs with missing teeth, bird cages whose little feathered throats had gone mute. He never hurried over any of it. He washed his hands first, then laid each object under a green-shaded lamp and listened before touching a screw. Listening for August was not passive, it was labour. He taught Elin that a tuning comb did not merely make music because it was struck. Each tooth had to be filed to its honest pitch. Not too much, not too little. And the last part was always the slowest because metal remembered every careless hand. He showed her how to pluck a comb tooth with a sliver of horn and hear whether it sat a fraction sharp. He showed her how to place pins in a brass cylinder, how the angle mattered, how the height mattered, how a pin that leaned wrong would make the whole phrase limp. He let her use tweezers before he let her use a file. He let her use a file before he let her touch a comb. Trust came in instruments. Their ritual did not change for years. At 10 in the morning, he boiled coffee for himself and warmed milk for her in a dented saucepan. At noon, they ate tomato sandwiches at the back step where honeysuckle crossed the fence and trains passed with a slow iron sorrow. In the afternoon, he played one machine from the high shelf, never the same one twice. A cylinder box from Tranquil, a German disc box with a cracked walnut lid, a small singing bird automaton whose blue feathers had faded to the colour of washed denim. When the bird rose from its filigree cover and opened its beak, Elin could see the little bellows move beneath the breast. It was not alive, it was not dead, it was careful imitation, kept alive by patience. August had a wife once, though she was gone before Elin knew him. Her photograph stood on the shelf by the 3 clocks. He called her Marianne when speaking to adults and Mrs. Bell when speaking to the machines, as if courtesy reached further than death. On rainy Saturdays he told Elin that Marianne could hear a cracked jewel bearing from across a room, and that she once tuned a comb tooth by candlelight during an ice storm. He said women had always worked at benches, whatever the ledgers forgot to record. The quote Elin carried from him came on a November afternoon when she had ruined a strip of blued spring steel by forcing it. She had tried to hide the piece beneath a rag, but August only lifted it into the lamp glow and ran one finger along the bend. A machine only sings when every hidden piece is given its proper room, he said. At the time, Elin heard only the correction. Years later, sleeping on floors and moving through cities as if trying not to leave a print, she would understand the mercy of it. The smallest part did not have to become large. It only had to be allowed its exact place. August died when Elin was 15, in late summer after the first pear had fallen from the tree behind his shed. He did not die dramatically. He sat down in his shop chair after supper, with a comb blank in his left hand, and the radio giving a weather report from Little Rock, and he was gone before the forecast reached Sunday. Lenora and Elin took 2 buses to Conway for the burial. The greenhouse was locked when they arrived. A cousin neither of them knew well had already opened the drawers, carried off the best clocks, and sold the tools to a dealer from Missouri who paid in cash and did not write receipts. Elin found only what had been missed because it looked worthless. 3 broken comb teeth wrapped in paper, a bent awl, a roll of perforated paper with the first measure torn away, and 1 brass pin caught in a crack of the bench. She held that pin in her palm during the funeral. It was smaller than a grain of rice and bright as a held tear in the sun. After August, the world seemed to grow louder and less exact. The clinic where Lenora cleaned changed ownership. The motel stopped paying weekly. Their rent rose by $20, then by $30. Lenora began to cough in the mornings softly at first, as if apologizing to the room. She said it was dust, then weather, then nerves. By the time she admitted pain, the pain had already learned the layout of her body. There was a man who came into their lives, then wearing kindness like a pressed suit. His name was Carlton Voss, executive director of the Mercy Bridge Medical Fund, a charitable organization that kept its office on the 2nd floor of a brick building, with brass letters on the door and silk plants in the waiting room. He had smooth grey hair, a warm baritone voice, and hands that rested flat on a desk as if blessing paperwork. The clinic social worker gave Lenora his card. Mercy Bridge, she said, helped patients who fell between income thresholds. Lenora kept the card in her Bible for 3 days before calling. Voss met them on a Thursday. Elin remembered the exactness of that room more than his face. The ticking wall clock, the bowl of peppermint candies, the framed photograph of Voss shaking hands with a hospital trustee, the clean scent of lemon oil over carpet that had never known rainwater. He spoke to Lenora as if she were both fragile and fortunate. He said words like funding cycle, surgical window, donor approval, expedited review. He asked for signatures on forms Elin could not understand. Lenora signed them with a hand that trembled only at the end of her name. "We will not let you fall through," he told her. That sentence became a shelf on which her mother rested what little strength she had left. For a while the promise seemed to arrange the days. Lenora kept appointments. Elin took extra hours at a diner and brought home soup in paper cups. Bills arrived and Lenora placed them in a shoebox marked pending because Mr. Voss had said not to worry about bills until the disbursement posted. The surgery date was discussed, then postponed, then moved behind another review, another donor signature, another missing code. Voss always sounded patient on the telephone. He called Lenora Dear Mrs. Bell and told her courage was a form of medicine. By winter the cough had deepened. By spring the surgeon no longer used the word early. Mercy Bridge sent one partial payment to the hospital, enough to keep a collection office polite, but not enough to open an operating room. After Lenora died, Elin found copies of the grant approval buried inside a folder Voss's assistant had mailed by mistake. The approval had been real, the donor money had been real, the transfer trail ended in consulting expenses, community outreach, administrative discretion. The words were clean, the act beneath them was not. No one from Mercy Bridge attended the funeral. The apartment emptied by inches after that. First the bed frame went, sold to a woman with a pickup truck and 2 sons who would not meet Elin's eye. Then the kitchen table. Then Lenora's choir dress, folded in tissue, which Elin carried to the consignment shop and carried back because she could not bear the clerk's fingers on it. The landlord had been patient in the way men are patient when they have already decided the outcome. On October 2nd, 2023, a yellow paper was taped to the door with a strip of silver duct tape. By November 9th, the patience was finished. The eviction happened under a low sky, with rain threatening but not falling. Elin stood in the hall wearing her coat indoors because the heat had been cut off. A deputy with a red face and damp moustache watched from the stairwell, not unkindly, not kindly. The landlord carried a cardboard box from the bedroom and set it beside the door. On top lay Lenora's blue pillbox, the one with the worn Sunday lid, and beside it a framed photograph of her mother from younger days, mouth half open in song. The landlord tapped the box with 2 fingers. "You had time. Take only what you can carry." 8 words. They went into her like cold nails. Elin lifted the pillbox first. The photograph had shifted in its frame, and the glass held a long crack across Lenora's throat. For one breath, it seemed as if her mother had turned away from her, sealed behind glass, silent and unreachable after all the promises she had believed. That was the betrayal Elin could not name aloud. Not that Lenora had failed her, but that trust itself had worn her mother's face while leading them to the door. She did not argue. There are griefs too tired for argument. She took the pillbox, the brown coat, August's bent all wrapped in a sock, the torn roll of perforated paper, and a small cloth bag containing $17.43. The landlord closed the door before she reached the bottom step. Behind her, the lock turned with an efficient sound. For 6 weeks, Elin became a person without an address. She spent the first 2 nights in Pine Bluff, sitting upright in the last booth of a laundromat, where the owner let the dryers run until 2 in the morning because truck drivers washed there. The machines breathed warm lint into the air. She bought 1 cup of vending machine coffee and made it last until the clerk turned off half the lights. On the 3rd morning she rode a bus toward Little Rock because cities, from a distance, looked as if they contained more places to disappear. Her money dropped to $12.10 after the fare. In Little Rock, she slept once in the waiting area of the bus station, with her coat collar up and her pillbox held in both hands. A security guard woke her at 4 and said she had to have a ticket to stay. He did not raise his voice. That almost made it worse. She walked to the public library before it opened and stood with 5 other people under the overhang, all of them looking at the glass doors as if warmth were a country that might grant entry at 9. She learned the schedule of buildings: library at opening, hospital cafeteria at noon if she could blend with visitors, church basement on Tuesdays, train station restroom before midnight. She washed her hair in sinks and dried it beneath hand dryers that clicked off every 30 seconds. She kept August's awl wrapped in the sock and moved it from pocket to pocket, afraid she would lose the last object that knew his hand. From Little Rock she drifted to Conway because grief has its own bad compass. August's green house had been painted beige by then, the pear tree cut down. The washroom shop turned into a laundry porch with plastic baskets stacked in the window. She stood across the street for 10 minutes and did not knock. The house had forgotten her because houses are allowed to survive by becoming useful to someone else. Her money dropped to $9.86 after a bowl of chili at a gas station. A woman at a church meal told her seasonal work could be found near Fort Smith, packing holiday orders in a warehouse. Elin rode west on a discount ticket bought with nearly all she had left. The warehouse job lasted 2 days because she could not provide a current address for payroll, and the supervisor, apologetic but firm, said the system would not accept blank fields. In Fort Smith she slept one night in a hay barn outside Van Buren after walking until the road shoulders turned to mud. The farmer who found her at dawn did not call the sheriff. He only pointed toward the county road and said, "Best move on before my wife worries herself." She moved on. By the 5th week she had learned to count coins without taking them from her pocket. 4 quarters by the ridges, 3 dimes, a nickel worn slick, pennies gathered at the seam. She had $6.31 after buying crackers, then $5.19 after coffee, then $4.87 after a bus transfer she regretted as soon as she sat down. Hunger made the world exact. Every price became a gate. Every warm room had rules posted somewhere near the entrance. In Fayetteville, the hills rose blue and folded beyond the streets, and students passed her carrying laptops and paper cups, their faces open with deadlines and weather. She slept behind a closed copy shop where the exhaust vent breathed faint heat across the alley until a delivery driver arrived before dawn. In Springdale, she spent an afternoon in a grocery store pretending to compare cans because the lights were bright and nobody asked why she stayed. In Rogers, she stood under the awning of a closed tire shop during freezing rain and watched water bead on the toe of one shoe where the sole had begun to separate. The Ozarks in December did not shout their cold. They laid it on carefully. It entered through cuffs, through cracked shoe leather, through the tender place beneath the jaw. Elin became careful with movement because every unnecessary step spent heat. She became careful with memory too. She could not afford to open certain doors inside herself. Her mother's last week, August's empty shop, Carlton Voss's polished desk. These had to remain shut if she was to cross another morning. The classified ad found her in the Berryville Public Library on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky had the color of unwashed pewter. She had gone there for warmth and a place to sit without buying anything. The librarian, a woman with silver hair braided down her back, did not ask why Elin's hands shook when she signed the guest log. She only pointed toward the periodicals and said the radiator worked best near the local history shelf. Elin sat beside that radiator until feeling returned to her toes in little burning sparks. On the table lay a stack of county notices, auction bulletins, and one weekly paper folded open to the classifieds. Most of the listings were ordinary: used tires, laying hens, a church piano 2 acres outside Green Forest. Near the bottom, boxed in a thin black line, was a county disposal notice so plain it seemed almost ashamed of itself. Unclaimed interior parcel. Former workshop room and storage rights. Spring Street rear access. Eureka Springs. Condemned structure. Buyer assumes all liability. Taxes, liens, removal, and municipal penalties. Minimum bid, $8. Cash only. No warranty. No utilities. No occupancy certification. Below it was a date, an office address, and the words final offering before demolition authorization. Elin read the notice 3 times, not because it made sense, but because it did not. $8 was not a price for a place. It was the cost of a sandwich and coffee in a careful town. It was what remained when something had been judged more burden than shelter. She touched the line former workshop room with one finger and felt, through the cheap newspaper, a pressure she could not explain. Workshop. The word had a bench inside it. A green lamp. A patient man bending over brass. It had the smell of oil and dust and winter milk warming on a stove. It had small drawers labelled by hand. It had August Bell saying the shop had been impatient. She unfolded her coat lining in the restroom stall and counted what remained, $8.22. The $8 bill was not a bill, of course, but a 5 and 3 ones softened by weather and handling. The coins she left in the lining. She stood there under the buzzing fluorescent light with the money in her palm, the pillbox in her pocket, and no address to lose. Travelling to Eureka Springs would take nearly everything that was not the bid itself. She asked the librarian for the road distance and received a printed map with 2 routes marked in blue pen. The shorter way curved south and west through hills that looked on paper like a folded blanket. There was no bus all the way. A regional line could take her part of it. After that would be walking, or luck, or the mercy of strangers who owed her nothing. She returned to the radiator and sat until closing outside the windows. Early dark gathered against the glass. People came and went with books under their arms. A boy laughed near the computers. Somewhere in the building a cart squeaked once every few minutes as the librarian shelved returned volumes. The world continued in its regular manner, indifferent but not cruel, and Elin held the classified page until the ink warmed beneath her thumb. At 6, the librarian came by with her coat already on. "You need that page, honey." Elin looked up. "If I may." The woman studied her only long enough to decide not to embarrass her. Then she brought scissors from the desk and cut out the notice with careful hands. She slipped it into a library envelope and wrote the county office address across the front. "Road gets steep there," she said. "Eureka's built like it was poured down the side of the mountain and left to dry." Elin thanked her. The words came out rough. That night she slept beneath the overhang of a closed garden centre outside town, wrapped in her coat with the envelope against her ribs. Wind moved through stacked clay pots and made a hollow ringing sound. She listened to it until morning, not because it comforted her, but because listening was the one inheritance nobody had managed to sell. At dawn, she bought no breakfast. She washed her face in the restroom of a gas station and used 2 fingers to smooth her hair. Then she began moving north and west, carrying the pillbox, the torn paper roll, the bent awl, and the folded notice for a condemned room that had been waiting beyond the edge of the map. By the time the hills of Carroll County rose in front of her like weathered backs under winter trees, Elin had spent nearly everything she possessed to reach a place nobody else wanted. And the county clerk had already laid the deed on the counter. The first bus left before sunrise, coughing blue exhaust into a station lot where frost lay in pale seams along the curb. Elin boarded with her coat buttoned wrong because her fingers were slow from cold, and she sat near the middle, where the heater came up through a rusted grate in the floor. The driver tore the corner from her ticket without looking at her face. Outside the window the streets gave way to fields, then to wooded rises, then to the long grey folds of northwest Arkansas in winter. She rode as far as the route would carry her. The last town on the bus line had a filling station, a diner with a paper Santa taped in the window, and a road that bent north between cedar thickets and bare hardwoods. The driver told her she could wait inside until the next run came back through in the evening, but she had no reason to go backward. He studied the county notice in her hand for a moment, then nodded toward the road. 7 miles if you keep to the shoulder, he said. Longer if the fog settles. She thanked him and started walking. The temperature that morning was 27 degrees by the bank sign, and it did not rise much while she climbed. The cold had a dry edge to it, clean as a knife pulled from a drawer. Gravel shifted beneath her shoes. Trucks passed with a sound like tearing cloth, pushing air against her coat and lifting the torn hem of her skirt. She learned to step down into the ditch before each bend, because roads in hill country held surprises close until the last second. By noon, the sky had lowered. A hawk circled above a pasture where the grass had gone the colour of old rope. She ate 4 crackers beside a cattle gate and drank from a gas station bottle she had filled in the restroom before leaving. The water had warmed against her side, but not enough. When she walked again, one heel had begun to rub raw, and she placed her foot more carefully after that, as if the road were a floorboard that might give way. Late afternoon brought mist. It came first as a dampness on her eyelashes, then as a white breath rising between the trunks. She had not reached town. The printed map folded in her pocket had softened at the creases, and the blue pen line blurred where her thumb had pressed it. A mile marker appeared, then vanished behind her. A mailbox leaned at the entrance to a gravel lane, its red flag hanging loose like a tired tongue. The barn stood beyond the mailbox, half hidden behind a stand of sumac and young cedar. It was not abandoned, exactly. Nothing in hill country was ever entirely without witness. The roof held, the gate hung on one hinge. Bales of hay were stacked inside along the north wall, dry beneath a loft where dust and sparrow droppings patterned the boards. Elin stood in the doorway for a full minute, listening for people, dogs, engines, any sign that she would be trespassing into someone's present need. There was only the soft ticking of cooling metal and the faint animal warmth left in the hay. She climbed behind the bales after dark. The night in the hay barn was colder than the road. At 2 in the morning, according to the cracked face of the little watch she had bought years before from a church rummage sale, it was 22 degrees. She knew this because the barn had an old thermometer nailed to a post near the tack hooks, and she checked it when she got up to move her feet. Sleep came in scraps. Mice stirred inside the wall. A horse, somewhere beyond the barn, gave one low, thoughtful sound. The hay scratched her cheek and left little splinters in her sleeves. Before dawn, she woke with her hands tucked beneath her arms, and the library envelope flattened under her ribs. For a moment in the blue dark, she could not remember which ceiling belonged to her. Then a drop of thawing frost fell from the rafter and landed on the back of her neck. She sat up slowly, brushed hay from her coat, and left the barn as she had found it, except for the narrow hollow where her body had been. The road rose sharply after that. Hills pressed near. Limestone showed in cuts along the shoulder, pale and layered, with roots gripping it like knuckles. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted enough for her to see houses set into the slopes, porches clinging to angles that would have seemed impossible in flatter country. Then the road curved and Eureka Springs appeared not all at once but in pieces. A roof below street level, a stone wall above a storefront, a staircase climbing where a sidewalk ought to have been, windows stacked against the hillside like books left open. The town seemed built by people who had trusted the mountain to hold them. Elin entered along a street that twisted between gingerbread trim, iron railings and weathered stone retaining walls darkened by winter damp. There was a bakery with a hand-painted sign and a bell over the door. A pharmacy displayed postcards, cough syrup and little jars of honey in its window. A narrow bookstore leaned beneath a green awning, its outdoor shelf chained shut against weather. Farther down stood a cafe called the Basin Cup, where steam clouded the glass and a woman inside was setting chairs straight. Across from it, a hardware store kept its windows full of stovepipe, lantern wicks, snow shovels and coiled rope. At the corner, the old hotel rose in pale stone and balconies, dignified and tired, as if it had been watching arrivals for more than a century and believed none of them were final. People noticed her without staring. A man sweeping his doorway paused, then went on sweeping. 2 women in wool coats crossed the street in front of her, talking softly about a choir rehearsal. A dog barked from an upper porch and then lost interest. Somewhere below, water ran in a hidden channel, its sound threaded beneath tires and footsteps. The county clerk's office was in a brick building that did not try to be charming. It sat square against the grade with a ramp along one side and an American flag hanging damp from a pole near the entrance. Inside, the heat was immediate and almost painful. Elin stood just beyond the door while her ears warmed and her eyes adjusted to fluorescent light. The floor was speckled linoleum, the kind polished so often it had become its own dull map. A bulletin board held notices for tax sales, road closures, jury duty, and one faded flyer asking volunteers to help clean a cemetery on County Road 302. Behind a counter of scarred oak sat a woman in a cream cardigan, writing in a ledger with a blue pen. She had iron-grey hair cut blunt under the jaw, large square glasses on a silver chain, and a face that seemed to have been made not stern but accurate. Her nameplate read Martha Cullen, County Clerk. Beside it stood a brass stamp on a black pad, a jar of sharpened pencils, and a ceramic mug printed with a courthouse drawing in brown ink. The woman looked up. "You are here for the disposal bid." It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Martha Klein took in the coat, the swollen hands, the envelope, the shoes still showing hay along one seam. She did not soften her voice, but she lowered the ledger shut with care. "Come to the side window. The counter is warmer there." Elin moved where she was told. The side window looked into a records room lined with shelves and flat metal drawers. A clock above the door ticked 1 minute past 10. Martha pulled a manila folder from a stack and opened it to reveal 3 forms, a parcel map, a key on a paper tag, and 2 photographs of a building so narrow and dim it seemed less like property than an oversight. "You understand this is not a residence," Martha said. "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has not inspected it for safe occupancy?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no current water service? No electric meter, no certificate, no warranty, and no promise that any part of it can be saved?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand back taxes attached to the parcel rights, and municipal fines may be assessed if the structure collapses or becomes a public hazard?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition has already been recommended? Buying it does not stop that process unless you file for a repair review. Pay the first fee, and show visible stabilization before the posted deadline." "Yes, ma'am." Martha removed her glasses and polished them with a folded cloth. Her eyes, without the glass, looked more tired than stern. "Child, people buy condemned things because the word property makes them feel richer than the word liability. I am required to tell you that a deed can be a rope around the neck if you do not know its weight." Elin held the envelope flat between both palms. "I know it has weight. That is not the same as knowing how much." "No, ma'am." For the first time, Martha Klein looked at her for more than a moment. Then she replaced her glasses and turned the folder toward Elin. "Cash bid is due before signature." Elin opened the seam of her coat lining. It took longer than it should have because the thread had tangled. She set the money on the counter in careful order, a 5, then 3 ones, each bill softened and creased, each edge no longer crisp. Martha counted it once with 2 fingers, then again more slowly, as if confirming not the amount but the act itself. She wrote a receipt by hand rather than printing one. The pen scratched loudly in the office. The deed was plain: parcel language, former workshop designation, rear access easement, condemnation notice attached, buyer assumption of risk. Elin read every line she could understand and paused over every line she could not. Martha did not rush her. Once, a man came in asking about vehicle tags, saw the papers spread out, and sat down quietly near the door. The clerk held up one finger without turning around, and he obeyed. "Sign here," Martha said at last. "Full legal name." Elin signed. The pen felt too heavy, its tip catching slightly on the last letter. Martha sanded the signature with a little shaker of fine powder, an old habit from another century, then lifted the brass stamp. It came down with a deliberate weight. The sound filled the room. Not loud. Final. Martha signed beneath her, added the county seal, then placed the key on top of the folded papers. It was not the key to the front door, she explained. That door had been nailed from inside some time after the last inspection. This key fit the iron gate on the alley stair. if the lock had not frozen. The rear entrance might be reachable from Spring Street if the retaining wall had not shifted further. She drew directions on the back of a tax notice with the same blue pen from her ledger. Down Main, she said. Left at the Flatiron Building. Keep to Spring until you pass the old bathhouse steps. You will see a rusted railing and a black walnut growing out over the alley. Do not trust the first stair. It is cracked. The second landing has no outer rail. If the boards feel soft, back out. Yes, ma'am. And if anyone tells you the city owns it outright, they are remembering an argument, not a record. The city tried. County held the paper because of unpaid assessments and a boundary error. The rear wall sits on one line, the upper room on another. It annoyed 6 departments for nearly 40 years. There was something like satisfaction in her voice at that last sentence. Elin folded the directions and tucked them into the envelope with the deed. Martha watched the movement, then glanced at the signature line again. Her brow drew in slightly, not in suspicion but recognition, trying to find its shelf. Bell, she said. Elin's fingers stilled. Yes, ma'am. Any relation to August Bell from Conway? The office seemed to tighten around the name. Even the man waiting near the door looked up from his phone. Elin could have said no. It might have been easier. Names made claims, and claims made openings through which loss entered. Instead, she nodded once. He was my mother's uncle. Martha sat back. Behind her, the records room clock ticked in its steady, dry voice. Well, she said, that changes nothing legally. Elin lowered her eyes to the key. No, ma'am. But I knew him by reputation. My father had a disc box repaired by him in the 70s. Walnut case, Swiss movement, played Lorena if the spring was not wound too hard. Martha's fingers rested on the folder edge. He wrote a letter with the repair, 3 pages explaining how to store it level and why children should be allowed to watch the mechanism. My father kept the letter in the box until the day he died. Elin did not trust her own voice for a moment. He believed machines should not be hidden from children. That sounds like the man. Martha opened the folder again and searched among the attached county photographs. She removed one, a grainy image taken through a broken pane. It showed a work table under dust, a shelf slanting above it, and, in the shadowed rear, something tall beneath a canvas cover. This place was listed once as Ormand Vale Mechanical Music. Before that, I do not know. After that, storage. After that, nuisance. It is not impossible your uncle knew of it. Men who repair rare things tend to know where rare things have died. She slid the photograph across the counter. Elin looked at the tall covered shape. The paper was poor, the image blurred, but some proportion in it made her chest go still. Not furniture. Not a cabinet. Something upright. Something with a posture. Martha spoke more softly. If August Bell taught you any of that trade, you may be the first buyer I have seen who did not come in here chasing copper pipe. Elin returned the photograph carefully. He taught me to listen first. The clerk nodded, as if this answer settled some private matter. She took a small white envelope from a drawer, placed the receipt inside, and added a second paper. This is the repair review application. Filing fee is waived for 30 days if the buyer can prove hardship. I'm not supposed to suggest that people prove hardship. I'm merely telling you what the ordinance says. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Take it to planning before the end of the month. They close early on Fridays. Then Martha did a peculiar thing. She opened the cash drawer, removed the 5031s Elin had paid, clipped them to a yellow slip, and placed them in a side compartment rather than the main tray. For audit, she said, though no one had asked. Elin gathered the deed, directions, application, and key. At the door, Martha called her name, not loudly. Elin turned. If the place is worse than the photographs, come back before dark. I can give you the address of the Methodist shelter in Berryville. No questions. Elin nodded. Outside, the day had brightened without warming. Eureka Springs held winter light in strange angles. It flashed from upper windows, disappeared beneath balconies, caught on wet stone, then returned at the next turn. Elin walked down Main Street with the deed under her coat and the key in her pocket, its teeth knocking lightly against the pillbox. The sound was small but regular. It made a rhythm she could follow. She passed the bakery, where bread cooled on racks behind fogged glass. A woman carrying flour sacks came through the side door and looked at Elin's shoes, then her face, then the folder under her arm. She did not speak, but she held the door open an extra second, letting a brief wash of warmth pass into the street. Elin kept walking. At the pharmacy window, a display of amber bottles and hand cream stood beneath a string of paper snowflakes. The pharmacist inside wore a white coat and was helping an older man measure blood pressure at a chair near the counter. At the bookstore, the owner was sweeping leaves from the recessed doorway, pushing them into the street with slow, meditative strokes. A cat watched from the window, one paw tucked beneath its chest. The Basin Cup Cafe had filled since morning. She could smell coffee, bacon, toasted bread, and something sweet with cinnamon. A corkboard near the door held business cards and handwritten notices: firewood, piano lessons, house cleaning, lost tabby. One card, yellowed at the edge, advertised antique repair by a man whose phone number had been crossed out. Elin paused just long enough to read it, then went on before hunger could become a voice. Spring Street climbed, it did not so much lead as negotiate with the hill. Stone walls rose on one side, porches hung on the other, and narrow staircases appeared between buildings, some public, some private, some seeming to begin nowhere and end against sky. A delivery truck idled beside a shop selling quilts and carved walking sticks. The driver was arguing mildly with the slope while carrying boxes uphill two at a time. She passed the old bathhouse steps Martha had mentioned, their stone treads damp with moss along the edges. Water seeped from a pipe set into the wall and ran in a thin silver thread toward the gutter. Above her, bare-limbed trees gripped the hillside, and among them stood black walnuts, their branches angular and dark, each one holding its own patient architecture against the sky. A dog began barking before she reached the alley. It was a brindled dog with a white chest, standing on the second-floor porch of a narrow blue house. Its bark was not fierce, it was official. A woman's voice came from inside, telling Roscoe to mind his manners. Roscoe barked twice more for the record, then retreated behind a porch chair, where he watched Elin through the railing with professional doubt. At the next bend, an older man in a canvas coat was carrying kindling from a shed to his back door. He stopped when he saw her looking at the rusted railing. "You lost?" "No, sir. I was told this way leads to the rear stairs." He set the kindling against his hip and looked her over in the exact way rural men sometimes look at bad weather, assessing likely damage before speaking. "You bought that music place?" "Yes, sir." County finally found someone poorer than the building. He did not smile when he said it. Then, perhaps hearing himself, he shifted the wood higher. Mind the second landing. Board near the wall is honest. Board near the drop is not. "Thank you." He nodded once and went inside. The alley behind Spring Street was not a true alley in the city sense. It was a narrow passage caught between stone, timber, and the hill itself, descending in crooked runs toward the lower street. Fallen leaves had gathered in pockets where the wind could not reach. A black walnut grew out over the drop, roots shouldering the retaining wall as if time had been pushing from beneath. The iron railing Martha described was fixed to a stone post by bolts furred with rust. Beyond it, stairs fell away into shadow. Elin tested the gate with the key. At first, the lock refused. She breathed warmth onto it, worked the key gently, then harder, then stopped before the metal could snap. August had taught her that force was often only ignorance wearing boots. She lifted the gate slightly on its hinge. turned the key again, and felt the old mechanism give with a reluctant click. The first stair was cracked clean through. She stepped over it. The second landing had lost its outer rail, and the drop beyond it fell 2 stories into a narrow well of stone, leaves, and broken bottles gone green with age. She kept one hand on the inner wall. The boards were damp, but one near the wall held. Another shifted under her heel and made a low complaint. She did not hurry. Below, the back of the building came into view by degrees. It was narrower than she had expected and taller than it had any right to be. Wedged between a limestone retaining wall and the rear of another structure whose windows had been bricked long ago, the lower portion was native limestone, rough-faced and darkened by moss, laid in uneven courses that still held their stubborn line. Above it rose a timber-framed room, 12 feet across at most and perhaps 30 feet long. Its clapboards weathered silver-grey beneath old flaking paint that might once have been deep green. The roof sloped sharply toward the alley, tin sheets patched in 2 places with tar, and 1 place with a flattened sign. A brick chimney rose crooked from the rear corner, its cap missing, its mortar joints pale with age. Over the nailed front door hung a narrow board sign, nearly hidden beneath soot and lichen. Ormand Vale Mechanical Music, Repair, Cylinders, Birds. The last word had almost disappeared. Only the B and part of the S remained, but Elin knew it. Her hand went to the awl in her pocket. The front entrance faced not the alley, but a short stone platform above the lower street, reached by another set of steps that had been blocked with a sawhorse and a municipal notice. The notice was sealed in plastic, nailed to the door frame, and printed with red letters that had faded toward pink. Unsafe structure. No entry. Violation. The words did what such words are meant to do. They made a place official in its abandonment. The rear door was smaller, set low beneath the overhang, its upper panel split, its knob missing. Someone had fastened it shut with a hasp and a rusted padlock, then later, perhaps after an inspection, driven 2 nails through a board across the jamb. The padlock on the hasp did not match the gate key. Elin stood with the deed in one hand, the key in the other, and understood that ownership did not mean welcome. She searched the sill, the stone ledge, the space behind a loose brick near the threshold. Her fingers found dirt, 2 acorn caps, a dead beetle, and a strip of metal bent into an L. The metal was not a key, but it was useful. She worked it under the nailed board, slowly, prying a fraction at a time until the first nail gave a dry squeal. The second took longer. Her hand shook with effort and cold. When the board came free, it fell against her shin and left a smear of rust on her stocking. The door still stuck. She leaned her shoulder against it. Nothing. She listened. Wood swollen at the bottom, not the top. The lower edge had taken water and pressed itself into the threshold. She found a loose piece of stone, wrapped it in the hem of her coat, and tapped along the bottom until the door shifted 1 careful inch. The smell came out for dust, mouse droppings, gold iron, old paper, dry wood, chimney soot, something faintly sweet beneath it all, like cedar kept shut in a drawer. It was the smell of a place that had not expected breath and did not know what to do with it. She pushed again. The door opened far enough for her to turn sideways and enter. The first room was dim even in afternoon. 2 boards had been nailed across the front window, leaving thin bars of light that crossed the floor and lit the dust in pale ladders. Shelves lined the left wall, most empty, some bowed under jars filled with screws, springs, washers, and brass fragments sorted by a hand that had once believed sorting mattered. A counter stood near the front, its glass display case cracked across one corner. Inside lay velvet pads bleached brown, a label card turned face down, and one porcelain knob shaped like a bird's egg. The floor tilted toward the alley, not sharply, but enough that a round object would have rolled if there had been one free enough to roll. Near the front door lay old mail, curled and fused by damp. A calendar from 1987 still hung on a nail behind the counter, the month of September showing a painting of a covered bridge. Someone had circled the 19th in red and written Call V in the square. The handwriting was not August's. Elin looked away from it, not because it meant nothing, but because she had learned that a room must be approached in order. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The front room had been for customers once. She could feel that in the arrangement of the counter, the waiting chair, the shelf where finished boxes might have sat, polished and obedient, before being carried back into parlours and nurseries and bedrooms where their songs belonged to families. There was a rug under the dust, its pattern reduced to hints of rust and blue. A bell hung above the nailed front door, so furred with cobweb that no air could move it. She took 3 steps, testing each board. The first held. The second dipped. The third answered with a dry pop from beneath. And she froze until the sound settled. A mouse moved somewhere behind the counter. Wind pressed at the boarded window. The building made no further objection. The back room lay through a narrow doorway with no door. If the front had been for receiving, the back had been for keeping. Workbenches ran along both walls, some buried beneath canvas, some exposed to grey drifts of dust. There were racks of tiny files, a vice mounted to a bench corner, shallow drawers with brass pulls, a treadle lathe with its belt broken and hanging like a dead vine. On one shelf sat 3 music box combs wrapped in paper so old the edges had browned. On another stood a row of brass cylinders, green with tarnish, each one pricked in patterns like a private night sky. Elin did not touch them. At the far end of the room, beneath a canvas cover that had gone stiff with dust, stood the tall shape from the county photograph. It rose nearly to her shoulder height before widening, then narrowing again. The canvas hung in folds, and beneath it something projected like a beak or a hand. She stood still, listening, until her own breathing quieted enough that she could hear water dripping somewhere behind the wall. It was too much for one afternoon. Hunger had hollowed her thoughts. Cold had settled into the bones of her feet. She had a deed, a key that fit only one lock, and a building whose silence was not empty but crowded. She needed a place to spend the night before any other problem could be handled. The rear corner near the chimney was driest. She found this by kneeling and laying her palm flat to the boards in several places. The front room floor held damp in its seams. The back doorway smelled of mouse paths. But beside the chimney, under a shelf of broken lamp chimneys and paper packets, the boards were cold without being wet. She cleared the area with the side of her shoe, then with her hands. Dust rose and made her cough until her eyes watered. From the front room she dragged the waiting chair, but one leg gave way before she had moved it 6 feet. She set it aside. The rug was too dirty and likely damp beneath, so she left it. In a drawer she found brown wrapping paper, brittle but clean in the middle where it had been protected from air. She laid several sheets over the boards. Over that she placed her coat, then changed her mind and put the coat back on. At last she sat with her back against the chimney and drew her knees close. The light moved out of the room by inches. Evening in that place did not arrive as darkness alone. It arrived as temperature. The window bars turned black against the last grey. The shelves lost their edges. Somewhere in the walls metal contracted with tiny ticks, and the whole building seemed to settle around her, not gently, not roughly, but with the indifferent patience of a thing that had outlasted being wanted. From the street below came the faint sound of tires on wet pavement, then voices, then nothing. The town closed upward and downward, porch by porch, window by window. Elin took the blue pillbox from her pocket. Inside were no pills now, only a brass pin, 3 broken comb teeth, and the smallest folded corner of Lenora's choir photograph, the piece she had saved after the glass cracked. She opened it under the last of the light and touched each object once. Not for luck. Luck had never been a reliable trade. She touched them to know where she was. Then she unwrapped the bent awl and set it beside her right hand. The night deepened. Cold came through the floor, it came through the chimney brick at her back, and through the open seams around the rear door. Her breath showed faintly in the darkness. She had slept in barns and stations and alleys, but this was different. This cold had ownership in it. It belonged to the room. It had been here before her, and would remain if she left. She did not sleep quickly. Every sound carried meaning until it proved otherwise. A drip behind the wall, a scratch near the counter, a distant bark from the porch dog above the alley. Once, something slid inside a drawer and stopped. She held the awl without lifting it. After a long time, her hand relaxed. Near midnight, moonlight found one high gap in the boards across the front window and laid a narrow stripe along the backroom floor. It reached the canvas-covered figure at the far end and touched the edge of what might have been a carved wing. Dust brightened there. The shape did not move, yet its stillness seemed intentional, like a performer waiting behind a curtain for music no one remembered how to play. Elin watched until her eyes closed. For the first time in weeks, no one asked her to move along. No guard tapped her shoe. No landlord turned a lock. No clerk needed a current address. The floor was hard. The room was unsafe. The roof had holes, yet the walls, crooked as they were, stood around her through the night. Near dawn, rain began, light at first, then steadier, speaking through the tin patches above her. Water found the west sill and entered somewhere out front. She could hear it ticking into a pan or a can. One drop at a time, exact and patient. The sound did not frighten her. It gave the darkness a measure. She pulled the coat tighter beneath her chin and listened. The room had waited, quiet and patient, keeping what had been forgotten. By the third morning, Elin knew which floorboards would answer her and which would keep faith. She had marked them without chalk, because chalk was a luxury and memory was free. The board beside the front counter gave a long groan if stepped on near its centre, but held well enough along the nail line. The plank before the back doorway dipped like a tired shoulder and had to be crossed with one foot on either edge. Near the chimney where she slept, two narrow boards were steady as pewbacks. She learnt them in darkness first, then in grey light, then in the uncertain gold of late afternoon, when the sun came slanting through the boarded front window and made each crack look deeper than it was. She had no water inside. The first day she found a public spigot near a pocket park 2 blocks down, half hidden beside a stone wall where mineral water once ran for visitors who came to Eureka Springs believing the hill itself could heal them. A brass plaque told a longer story than she had strength to read. The spigot worked after 3 hard turns. Rust-coloured water spat first, then cleared. She filled her bottle twice and carried it back uphill beneath her coat so it would not freeze as quickly. The outhouse stood behind the lower stone wall, though calling it an outhouse seemed generous. It was a leaning box of boards with a crescent cut in the door and a roof patched with asphalt scraps. The seat was sound enough if she did not trust it too broadly. The smell was old, dry and bitter, more abandoned than filthy. Someone had left a coffee can of lime inside, hardened at the top but usable beneath after she broke it with a stick. She used it carefully, because careful use was the only kind of ownership she could afford. The first 3 days were not dramatic. They were work of the smallest sort, the kind no one sees because it leaves no visible transformation from the street. She carried water, she swept 1 square yard of floor with a bundle of twigs tied in wire. She cleared mouse droppings from the front counter using a folded scrap of newspaper, then burned the paper outside in a tin lid until it curled black. She set a cracked ceramic bowl under the west sill drip and emptied it whenever the sound changed from ticking to plashing. She learned the pattern of wind around the rear door. She learned that the chimney draught moved backward when the fog settled low in the alley. She did not light a fire. Not yet. The chimney was too uncertain. And August's old lesson about hidden parts applied to brick and smoke as well as metal. A fire, badly drawn, could kill as quietly as hunger. So she wore every layer she owned and kept moving when daylight permitted it. At night, she slept in pieces and woke to listen. On the 4th morning, after a hard frost painted the inside of the rear window in white fern shapes, she walked to the hardware store she had passed on her first day. The sign above the door read O. Pritchard Hardware in black letters shaded with gold, though the gold had dulled until it was almost the colour of dust. Inside, the place was narrow and deep, warmed by a black stove near the back, and smelling of iron, seed packets, paraffin, rope, oiled leather, and the faint mineral scent of fertilizer in burlap sacks. Glass cases held pocket knives, hinges, plumb bobs, and drawer pulls. Stovepipe elbows hung from the ceiling like sleeping birds. Wooden bins near the door were labelled carriage bolts, cut nails, stove gasket, sash cord. A row of storm lanterns stood on a high shelf, their chimneys catching the stove glow. Behind the counter, a man in his late 60s was repairing the chain on a red-handled pipe cutter with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He had a narrow face, amber-brown eyes, and white hair combed straight back from a widow's peak. One of his ears was missing its lower lobe, not from violence, it seemed, but from some old accident involving a tool that had not forgiven carelessness. His hands were broad, dry, and cross-hatched with little scars. The name stitched on his canvas apron read Silas. He did not ask what she needed until she had looked around long enough to be overwhelmed. "You are the girl in the music shop," he said. The words were not unkind. They were simply local. "Yes, sir. Thought so. Folks have been using your alley to turn around for 20 years. Had to move a truck yesterday. I'm sorry. Was not your truck." He set the pipe cutter down and leaned both hands on the counter. "What is the first problem?" There were many answers. Roof. Door. Water. Heat. Food. Papers. Feet. A human body could become a list if hunger held the pencil long enough. Elin looked toward the black stove and chose the answer that would keep her alive. Chimney? Silas nodded once, approving not the problem, but the order. Smoke backing? I have not lit it. Good. Better afraid before than sorry after. He came around the counter and took a small flashlight from his apron pocket. Can you pay today? No. Sir. Can you pay someday? Elin kept her eyes on the floor. I hope to. Hope is not a ledger. No, sir. He studied her for a moment, then he walked to the back shelf, pulled down a thin blue booklet with water stains along the spine, and laid it on the counter. The title read Practical Repairs for Wood Stove, Chimney, Roof and Sash, 1968 Revised Edition. A price sticker in the corner said 25 cents, crossed out long ago. This is free because nobody with sense trusts a manual older than their knees. But it still knows some things. He tapped the cover. You read before touching. Twice if tired. 3 times if scared. Yes, sir. And I can open an account for materials under the parcel address. I do not have proof that I can pay. Did not ask for proof. I should not take credit. I cannot answer for. Then answer for it one item at a time. He slid a ledger from beneath the counter and opened it to a clean page. The paper was ruled in blue with red margins. He wrote the property name instead of her own at first, then looked up. Name, Elin Bell. His pen paused only slightly. Not enough to make a question. He wrote it down. You will not buy what you do not need, he said. You will not buy pretty. You will not buy new, if used will serve. You will return tools clean by dark unless we agree otherwise. You will tell me before you do something foolish, unless it is already done, in which case you will tell me after. The corner of his mouth moved once. Yes, sir. He began assembling the first list on brown wrapping paper, speaking as he wrote, 1 stiff chimney brush, 6-inch round wire, used $3, 2 fiberglass rods, mismatched threads but serviceable, $1.25 for both, 1 flat scraper, second-hand 75 cents, 1 dust mask from an open box 10 cents, 1 pair of canvas gloves with a repaired thumb 40 cents, 1 small galvanized pail dented 25 cents, 1 roll of black stove tape because the clean outdoor would likely have gaps 55 cents, 1 box of wooden matches 6 cents, 1 pound cornmeal from the grocery shelf near the register 12 cents, 1 tin of beans dented but not swollen 9 cents. Food goes on a separate line, Elin said quietly. Silas looked at her. It all goes on the line that keeps you standing. He added a candle stub from behind the counter and did not write it down. The total came to $6.52, all of it debt. Elin copied the amount in the back of the blue manual with the stub of pencil he handed her. When she had finished, Silas tied the rods together with twine and gave her instructions for the chimney. Not broad advice. Exact work. Start from below if the roof won't hold. Your chimney has a clean-out door at the base, alley side, unless rust ate it. Open that first. Lay wet paper if you have it. Creosote falls mean. Brush upward in short turns. Do not ram. If you hit a bird nest, pull. Do not push. You push a nest. You wedge it. You wedge it. You climb. And if you climb that roof before someone looks at it, I will close your account and call you foolish in church. I do not attend church here. Sound carries. The manual, the brush, and the food felt heavier on the walk back than their size could explain. Debt has weight too. But this weight was different from the deed. It had witness in it. Someone had written her name in a ledger without making her prove that she deserved ink. The chimney took 6 hours and most of the next day. She began with the clean-out door, found exactly where Silas said it would be, a small iron square behind a drift of leaves at the chimney base outside. The hinge was rusted shut. She soaked it with hot water from the public spigot, carried in her bottle and warmed beside her body beneath the coat, then worked the latch with August's awl until it opened with a flake of red dust and one sharp cry of metal. Behind it lay soot packed thick as black felt. Inside, she covered the hearth opening with damp newspaper she found beneath the counter and rags torn from the least useful part of her skirt lining. She tied one rag across her mouth beneath the paper mask because the mask alone gapped at her cheek. Then she knelt, fed the first brush rod upward, and turned. The brush rasped against brick. Soot fell immediately, not a little. It came down in dry sheets and granular clots, striking the newspaper with a soft, dirty hiss. Creosote had glazed parts of the flue, hard and shiny as black candy, especially where the chimney bent near the roofline. She worked the scraper first along the lower reach, then the brush, then added the second rod and worked higher. Her shoulders burned by the first hour. By the second, black dust had entered her sleeves, her hairline, the creases beside her nose. By the third, she stopped hearing the town outside and heard only the flue. Short turns. Pull. Not push. Let the brush cut. Do not force. At one point the brush struck something springy. She stopped at once. Nest. She withdrew the rods inch by inch, twisting gently backward. Bits of grass, twine, feathers, and one mummified acorn came down in a clot the size of a hat. She carried it outside in the galvanized pail and set it beyond the wall. A chickadee landed on a walnut branch above her and scolded as though she had mishandled family property. I know, she told it. Her voice startled her. It was the first sound she had made in hours. By late afternoon the flue began to answer differently. The brush no longer rasped through packed resistance but whispered against brick. She opened the rear door, then the front window gap, and held a strip of torn paper near the fireplace. The air drew inward, faint but true. Not enough for confidence. Enough for the next test. She cleaned the hearth. She removed the damp paper, folded the soot inward, and carried it outside in 3 careful trips. She wiped the firebox bricks with a rag until their red came through in places, dark and scarred but whole. The damper, stiff with rust, moved after she worked it slowly with the flat scraper, up, down, up, not far but far enough. At dusk she laid the first fire. There was no romance in it. She used 3 twists of paper, 2 dry splinters from a broken drawer bottom, and a handful of kindling shaved with the awl because she had no knife suitable for the work. She set the pieces loose, not tight, remembering August showing her how flame needed room the way sound needed room. She struck one match, it broke. She struck another and cupped it with both hands. The paper caught. The splinters smoked. For one anxious breath the smoke rolled outward into the room, grey and bitter, and Elin nearly smothered it with the pail. Then the chimney took hold. The flame stood upright. Smoke pulled back. narrowed, and disappeared into the dark throat above. She sat on her heels and watched until the kindling became coals. Only then did she open the tin of beans. The first hot meal in the shop was beans warmed in the dented pail set on 2 bricks beside the small fire, stirred with a strip of clean wood because she had no spoon she trusted. She made cornmeal mush in the same pail afterward, burning the bottom because she did not yet know how the heat moved. It tasted of smoke, iron, and grit. It was the finest meal she had eaten since her mother died, though she did not say so, because saying such a thing would have asked too much of the room. That night. Heat remained in the chimney brick for almost an hour after the fire died. She slept with her back to it and woke only twice. The next morning, warmer by a few degrees and steadier in her hands, she began the inventory of the workroom. She made a ledger from the back pages of the blue manual, writing small to preserve space. The first drawer contained screws sorted by head type, though many had rusted together. The second held music wire in coils, brittle where the paper wrappers had failed. The third contained 12 governor fans, 4 bent, 8 usable. The fourth was empty except for mouse-chewed tissue and a brass washer shaped like a crescent. On the left bench she found a staking set missing 2 punches, a pin vise, 3 oil bottles with hardened corks, a cracked loop, and a little ebony-handled screwdriver, so fine it looked like a drawing of a tool rather than the tool itself. The shelves took longer, brass cylinders in 4 sizes, each tagged in pencil, comb blanks wrapped in wax paper, 2 cracked soundboards, bellows leather, dry but not entirely gone, a stack of perforated rolls tied with blue cotton tape, their labels written in a formal hand, Sweet Afton, The Last Rose of Summer, Arkansas Traveller, Nearer, My God to Thee. Wooden bird bodies without feathers lay in a shallow tray, each carved with a hollow breast for bellows and linkage. Beside them sat boxes of tiny glass eyes, black, brown, amber, and 1 improbable blue. She found records too, not business ledgers complete enough to satisfy a tax office, but fragments, repair tickets, parts orders, a note about a shipment delayed by flooding, a customer's letter from Hot Springs asking whether a bird that had belonged to her grandmother might ever sing again, receipts from 1929, 1931, 1935, then a gap. Later papers from the 1950s, written in another hand. The shop had lived more than one life. It had gone silent in stages. She saved the covered figure for last because it had the greatest stillness. On the second afternoon of inventory, she cleared the floor around it. The canvas was fastened at the bottom with a cord stiffened by dust. She loosened the knot with the awl, lifting fibres one at a time until it gave. The cover did not come away easily. It had clung to varnish in places, and when she raised it, dust rose in a grey shawl that made her step back, coughing. The figure beneath was a bird, but no bird from any field or river. It stood nearly as tall as Elin, mounted on a mahogany pedestal with carved panels and brass paw feet. Its legs were slender metal sheathed in gilt, its body formed of layered brass and painted wood beneath feathers faded from emerald and gold to moss and wheat, its wings folded close, each feather made separately and pinned with minute rivets. The neck arched forward in an attitude both proud and wounded. The beak, once lacquered black, had cracked along one side. Glass eyes, dark amber, with a ring of pale brown, looked not at Elin but slightly past her left shoulder, as if awaiting a conductor only it could see. A singing bird automaton, but not the little kind August had shown her. This one was built on the scale of a human companion, a parlour marvel from the age when craftsmen made wonder by hiding labour inside beauty. Its pedestal held crank access on one side, a winding arbour on the other, and a narrow slot near the back where a perforated music roll might feed through. Dust lay along the shoulders. One wing-tip had lost a feather. A brass plaque on the pedestal had tarnished until the words were almost unreadable. She rubbed it with the corner of her sleeve. Vale's Great Ozark Thrush, Ormand and Vale, Eureka Springs. 1908. Not a thrush, she knew. Thrushes did not stand like that. But names in workshops often belonged as much to pride as to nature. She did not try to wind it. A mechanism that had not moved in decades could be ruined by one impatient turn. Instead, she examined what she could see. Linkages beneath the wing were present. Bellows leather inside the breast had cracked along one fold. The roll feeder was jammed with a strip of paper torn and browned. The crank handle was missing, though the arbor remained. The pedestal seemed sound at first glance, but when she placed both hands on it to test the weight, she noticed the anomaly. It was too heavy. Not merely heavy because mahogany is dense and brass is honest. The weight was wrong for its visible construction. She tried to shift it 1 inch across the floor and could not. The base did not scrape. It resisted as if fastened from beneath, though no bolts entered the boards that she could find. She knelt and examined the paw feet. Each rested on a square brass plate. The rear left plate had a faint wear line around it, curved like the edge of a concealed turn. Sound test next. She tapped the side panels with her knuckle. Front panel, dull wood over hollow space, right panel. The same though, partly blocked by a gear housing. Left panel, lower pitch near the bottom. Rear panel, different, not louder, closer. The sound ended too soon, as if the wood covered not emptiness but a second skin. Weight test. Then sound. Then seams. August's order returned to her hands before her mind named it. She held the candle stub near the rear panel and watched the flame tremble at a hairline crack in the carving. Air moved there, a compartment, or a trapped void, or only failed glue. She searched the pedestal again and found beneath a carved wreath a cedar disc, no wider than a silver dollar set flush into the mahogany. It was not decorative. Cedar among mahogany had purpose. Its grain ran crosswise, and at its center was a tiny depression polished by touch. She pressed it. Nothing. She turned it with her thumb. Nothing. She listened. There, under the stillness, was the faintest mechanical catch, not engaged but waiting. A release linked to something else. Not pressure alone. A sequence. The bird had been built to open only when asked properly. For 2 more days, she left it closed. This was not restraint as virtue. It was fear of ruining the only wonder the place had offered. She cleaned around it, studied the roll feeder, and read every label she could find. The torn strip jammed in the back slot was part of a perforated roll, but its first measures were missing. She removed it with tweezers from a drawer, easing the paper free millimeter by millimeter. The holes were rectangular, arranged in rows that corresponded to notes and timings. Some rows were wider where chords or imitation birdsong had been punched to trigger several valves at once. She knew enough to know she did not know enough. In the lower left drawer of the bench nearest the automaton, she found a narrow packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with black thread. Inside were 4 paper rolls, each better preserved than those on the open shelf. The labels had been written in red ink. Test Sequence A, Test Sequence B, Trush Call, Spring, Vale Private, Do Not Demonstrate. The last roll made her hands pause. She set it on the bench and opened the other packages first. There were more oilcloth bundles under the bench, hidden behind a false back in the drawer space, not secret in any grand way, but kept from casual reach. She found them by removing a drawer that stuck halfway and seeing that the cavity behind it was shallower than the bench itself. The first bundle contained tools, a comb lifter with an ivory handle cracked at the ferrule, 3 burnishers, a set of reamers nested in a leather case, a pair of fine pliers whose jaws met exactly, a staking hammer wrapped in chamois, and 2 gauges marked in thousandths. The metal had been oiled before storage and remained bright beneath its dark wrapping. The second bundle held raw material, pin wire in labelled gauges, brass rod, blued spring steel, thin bellows leather, felt tiny screws wrapped in paper twists, and a packet of bird feathers, each one separated by tissue, emerald, gold, brown, a green so dark it became black, unless turned to the light, not enough to clothe the great bird, but enough to mend a wound. The third bundle was a tin box the size of a prayer book. She did not open it at once. She set it on the bench, washed her hands at the public spigot, returned, and warmed her fingers briefly near the stove. The box was painted dark blue, scratched along the corners with a label frame but no label. Its latch resisted, then lifted. Inside lay cotton, yellowed with age, covering a stack of paper packets and 2 cloth rolls. The first packet held money. Elin closed the lid. The room seemed to lean nearer. She stood there for a long moment, bone hand flat on the cold tin, listening to the fire settle. Money in stories often arrives with music, with revelation, with some grand turn of light. This money lay in old cotton and said nothing. It had the smell of metal, paper, and cedar. It did not forgive. It did not explain. It only existed. She opened the box again because not opening it would not make it less real. The cash had been sorted with terrible care. Banknotes wrapped in paper bands, some marked 1936, 1941, 1948, silver certificates, Federal Reserve notes, a few large-size bills older than the rest, soft at the folds and kept between sheets of waxed paper. There were envelopes of coins too, each labelled by denomination and year range. Mercury dimes, walking Liberty $half, standing Liberty quarters worn smooth across the shield, wheat pennies in paper tubes, buffalo nickels with dates nearly vanished, 2 Morgan silver dollars, 1889 and 1896, 1 piece dollar, 1922, wrapped separately in a square of blue cloth. She counted on the bench because the floor was too uneven. The work took hours. She made columns in the ledger, then checked them twice, then a third time after realizing she had skipped 1 envelope in fear of her own arithmetic. The banknotes came to $53,820. The coins, using face value because she did not know collector worth and would not pretend to, added $1,179.63. In the bottom of the tin, beneath the last cloth roll, she found another envelope containing 2 $2 bills and 31 cents in loose silver and copper. The total, by face value, was $55,001.94. She wrote it down, then sat back and stared at the numbers until they became marks again. $55,000 had been the number named in the hospital estimate after insurance denials, before fees changed, before delay did its hidden work. Not exact to the cent. Life was not so theatrical, but near enough to make her close the ledger and place both hands over it as if covering a wound. The second cloth roll held a military medal. Bronze, dark with age, suspended from a ribbon folded along lines so sharp it had clearly been stored with respect. The inscription named service in 1918. Tucked behind it was a card written in faded ink, PVD Nathaniel Ormand, Argonne. Returned to family by War Department, 1921. The words were spare. No grief can fit on government cardstock, though governments keep trying. The paper packets beneath the medal contained music rolls. Not the common titles from the shelf. These were finer, thinner, and each had a title hand-lettered in ink that had browned toward sepia. Lullaby for June Rain, Marianne's Waltz in G, 4 Calls of the Ozark Thrush, Processional for a Shop Door Reopening, Lenore Variant, Unpublished, Bird Song Study, Night Creek, Private Cylinder Index, Ormand Family, Lost Music, or at least music that had not expected to be found. Some rolls were perforated, some were master patterns. One was written in pencil on staff paper, with timing marks along the margin and notes about pin height, air pressure, tempo, and the particular stiffness of spring leather at 45 degrees. Elin turned each sheet with hands washed clean and dried twice on her skirt. Then she remembered the cedar disc. The tin box had been hidden in the bench, but the great bird's pedestal remained unopened. Whatever lay there had been guarded by sequence. The private roll waited on the bench. She should have stopped for the night. She had counted more money than she had ever held in imagination. She had uncovered tools August would have lifted with reverence. She had found a medal, music, and the first outline of a family she did not yet understand. Her hands shook, not with eagerness, but with the strain of receiving too much at once. Still, the bird waited. She set the private roll into the feeder without winding the automaton. The paper was fragile but not brittle. The feed pins engaged after she cleared a hardened flake of grease with the tip of the awl. The crank handle was missing, but among the raw material bundle she found a short brass rod that fit the winding arbor closely enough to turn by hand if guided. She did not attempt full motion. She wanted only to see whether the sequence connected to the hidden catch. The first turn produced nothing. The second moved the roll one line. Somewhere inside the pedestal, a pin lifted and fell. No sound came from the bird because the bellows were cracked, but the mechanism registered the note as a little dry click. She turned again. Click, a pause, 2 clicks close together, then a longer gap. The pattern was not melody in the room, only architecture, notes without voice, memory without breath. At the 12th motion, the cedar disc shifted beneath her thumb. Elin stopped. The pedestal gave a sound like a lock remembering its purpose. The rear panel did not spring open. It moved outward the width of a fingernail. She eased the roll free, set the brass rod down, and knelt behind the bird with the awl wrapped in cloth. She worked along the loosened seam. The panel released silently after the first inch, then swung on concealed brass hinges so finely fitted that they still moved after all those waiting years. Inside the pedestal was a narrow compartment lined in cedar. There was more money there, but not loose. A sealed canvas pouch, tied and waxed. Several master rolls wrapped in linen. A leather ledger. A packet of letters bound with green ribbon. A small envelope marked, in a hand that made her heart misstep, for the one who opens by listening. She did not open the letter. Not that night. She removed the contents one by one and laid them on the bench in the order found. The canvas pouch held the last part of the sum, mostly larger notes and coins already included in her final count, after she forced herself to recount properly. The master rolls were the finest of all, some bearing titles that did not appear in the tin box, and 2 marked as demonstration sequences for the great Ozark thrush. The leather ledger listed repairs, commissions, songs, family births, deaths, debts forgiven, payments accepted in eggs, firewood mending, and once, in 1933, a sack of turnips and a promise. The letters she left tied. The marked envelope she placed beside the blue pillbox. It had grown dark without her noticing. The fire was nearly gone. She added 1 splinter and watched flame take it, then bend toward the chimney. Her body was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. The room had changed, not visibly, but in its moral weight. That much money in a condemned shop did not feel like wealth. It felt like responsibility left in the cold too long. The tools were not prizes, the rolls were not curiosities, the medal was not a collectible. Each object seemed to ask for a steadier hand than hers. She carried the envelope outside. Rain had stopped. The alley shone under a thin moon. Water ran somewhere below the stone wall, fed by springs and roof lines and the long memory of the hill. Eureka Springs at night was not silent, but its sounds came layered and distant. A porch chain tapped. A car passed on the lower street. The brindled dog Roscoe gave 1 questioning bark, and then, perhaps recognizing that no threat worth rising for had entered his jurisdiction, went quiet. Elin walked down the stone steps slowly, 1 hand on the wall, until she reached the lower platform near the blocked front entrance. From there she could see across the narrow street to a gap between buildings where the land fell away. Water moved there in a black thread, catching moonlight on its broken surface. She stood and watched it without reading the letter. She had delayed reading hard things before. Hospital bills, grant forms, notices taped to doors, but this was not that. This delay was reverence and perhaps fear, because a letter addressed to the one who opened by listening had found the one inheritance she had not lost. She held the envelope against her coat and let the cold steady her. A truck passed above on Spring Street, tires hissing over wet pavement. Somewhere a door closed. The workshop behind her held its crooked stance against the hill. Inside, the great bird stood open at the back, its hidden compartment empty now, not robbed, but relieved. The money lay counted. The medal lay covered. The music rolls waited in their linen. Elin looked at the water until the moon shifted behind cloud. Only then did she go back inside, set the unopened letter beside the pillbox, and bank the coals under ash. The room had waited, quiet and patient, keeping what had been forgotten. Morning came without warmth, but it came clean. The rain had washed the alley stones until they held a dull shine, and the light entering through the boarded window had less grey in it than the day before. Elin woke beside the chimney with one hand resting on the blue pillbox and the other near the unopened envelope. For a moment she did not move. The room had the kind of stillness that comes after an object has been found, and before its meaning has been allowed to speak. She built a small fire first, because her hands needed steadiness more than courage. The kindling caught on the second match. Smoke rose, hesitated, then climbed. She warmed water in the pail, washed her fingers with a narrow strip of soap from the public restroom, dried them on the cleanest part of her skirt, and cleared the bench beneath the lamp. The envelope was cream once. Now browned at the edges, it had been sealed with red wax pressed by a mark she could not yet read. The handwriting on the front was formal, slanted and exact, but one letter struck her before any other. The capital B. It had the same long upper loop August used when labelling drawers, though this hand was older, more ornamental, almost musical, not his handwriting, related to it. A line of ink crossed the front. For the one who opens by listening. Elin used the bent awl to lift the wax without breaking the paper more than necessary. Inside was a folded letter, 6 pages, each sheet thin and strong, creased along lines that had held their discipline for decades. A faint smell rose from it. Cedar, dust, ink, and something like lavender long past its flower. She began to read. My dear one, whoever you are, if these pages are in your hands, then the cedar catch has opened properly, and the bird has heard enough of its own language to trust you. That means you did not pry the panel loose with impatience. It means you either knew the sequence, or you listened until the mechanism showed you the way. In either case, I greet you as kin in the only manner that matters to this house. My name is Adelaide Ormand Vale. I was born in 1882 in St. Louis, Missouri, the daughter of Elias Ormand, who came from Tranquil in Switzerland with a chest of comb blanks, worn files, and a hatred of careless tempo. My mother was Ruth Bell Ormand, born near Fayetteville in 1859, who could cut bellows leather thinner than paper and never wasted a pin. My grandfather, Lucien Ormand, was trained near the Jura Mountains and brought mechanical music through New Orleans after the war between the states had emptied so many parlors of song. His wife, Celeste Aubert, kept the accounts and punched the first paper rolls in our family line. Their son Elias married Ruth Bell in 1880, and from their joined hands came this room, this bench, and every hidden drawer you have already found or will find by patience. I write because Dr. Harriet Linwood of St. Vincent's Infirmary in Little Rock told me on March 14, 1951, that the growth in my lungs had passed beyond knife work. She spoke plainly, for which I thanked her. A person who has spent her life listening to thin metal sing can hear dishonesty in a sentence. I returned to Eureka Springs by bus with 3 months named aloud, and perhaps 6 if winter was merciful. I had no daughter living, no apprentice steady enough, and no lawyer I trusted to understand what ought to be inherited, and what ought merely to be owned. This trade closed before it died. Remember that difference. On October 3rd, 1918, a telegram came to this room naming my brother Nathaniel Ormand among the wounded in the Meuse-Argonne fighting in France. We had been repairing a Regina disc box for a family from Harrison that morning. My husband, Thomas Vale, read the paper once, folded it, and went into the alley because he did not want my father to see his face. Nathaniel came home after the armistice, but not whole, and by 1921 the War Department returned his medal and effects after fever took what the shell had spared. My father never again tuned a military march. He said no spring should spend itself on parade when boys had already spent their blood. Then came the lean years. Radios entered kitchens. Records grew cheap. The Depression taught people to sell the pretty things first and the useful things last. By 1937, Ormand and Vale no longer kept regular hours. By 1942, brass was for the war effort, steel was counted, and young hands went to factories where 1,000 identical parts mattered more than one honest note. Thomas died of pneumonia that winter after hauling coal for 3 neighbours before our own bin was filled. Our son, Samuel, enlisted in 1943 and was lost in the Ardennes in January of 1945. My father had died years before, and Ruth Bell Ormand, my mother, had gone nearly blind but still knew by touch when a comb tooth sat false. After Samuel's notice, I shut the front door and opened only for repairs I could not refuse. 30 years of silence, more or less, entered the walls by ordinary means. Dust is not sudden. Neither is forgetting. If you mean to restore the great Ozark thrush, begin not with the feathers but with the breath. Remove the bellows leather and save the old pieces as patterns. Use kid leather if you can obtain it, goat if you must. Never calf unless you wish the bird to gasp. Warm hide glue to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, no hotter, and keep it moving in the pot. Mix lampblack into the outer wash only after the first seal has cured. For the hinge cloth, cut on the bias. Leave 1 32nd inch more play than your eye wants. The eye is proud, and pride tears leather. For comb work, do not file a tooth while the metal is cold from the room. Hold the comb near a lamp or stove until it rests at ordinary hand warmth. Then pluck with horn, not steel. A sharp tooth is corrected from the root side in strokes, so small a vain person would call them nothing. Count 20 strokes, then stop. Listen. Count 5 more if needed. If you pass the note, do not chase it in a panic. Lower the neighbours to meet it only if the phrase permits. Music forgives adjustment, it does not forgive haste. The cylinder pins are nickel-silver in 3 heights marked in the long drawer beneath the south bench. The first height speaks to the comb. The second lifts the bird valve. The third governs the head turn. If you remake a roll, use paper with enough rag to survive damp and punch from the backside against maple. Do not oil the governor until you have cleaned the pivots with spirits and hair, not cotton. Cotton leaves a ghost. Hair leaves less. As for the money, I did not gather it because I distrusted banks alone, though I had reasons. Some of it came from repairs paid across years by people who could not bear to let a family song die. Some came from Thomas's war bonds, some from Samuel's insurance, some from my mother's savings folded into flour tins during years when women were told they did not understand accounts. I kept it here because I could not choose an inheritor by name. Blood wanders, names change. Houses pass through hands that do not hear them. Skill, however, announces itself in the manner of touch. If you are hungry, eat before you repair anything. If you are cold, make the chimney safe before you tune. If you are in debt, pay what keeps wolves from the door, but do not let money convince you it is the inheritance. Money is only stored labour, tools are stored instruction. Songs are stored breath. A house, when it has been kept by careful hands, is stored welcome. You may wonder whether you deserve what is hidden here. That is a heavy question and not always a useful one. Deserving is a word used too often by people who wish to stand at a gate with a ledger. I have seen cruel men praised for industry and tender women punished for trust. I have seen soldiers mailed home in boxes while speeches called it glory. I have seen a child calm a crying bird automaton by laying her palm on the case and waiting for the spring to settle. The world is not exact in its rewards, but a craft can be exact in its demands. Begin there. Care for what you can. Mend what will accept mending. Leave sealed what is not yet asking to be opened. There is a marker behind the house, where my father set a horseshoe into the black walnut after the flood of 1903. Beneath that tree we buried broken teeth from every comb we could not save, because my mother said even failed music ought to rest near roots. You will find the mark if you stand with your back to the rear door at sunset and look where the last light touches iron. If no one ever comes, then the room will close around these words until demolition or weather finishes what silence began. If someone does come, and if that someone has opened the bird by patience, then let this be plain. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Adelaide, Ormand Vale, Eureka Springs, Arkansas, June 1951. Elin read the letter once without moving except to turn the pages. Then she read it again. The second reading was slower. She paused where the names crossed generations like a careful stitch. Ruth Bell Ormand, The name Bell lying there, not proof of anything useful in a courthouse, not a claim that could repair a roof, but a thread reaching from her pocketed awl to a woman who cut bellows leather thinner than paper. She touched the line with one clean finger and then withdrew her hand as if the ink might bruise. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, not new creases, the old ones. She pressed each fold with the side of her thumb and slipped the letter back into its envelope, leaving the wax seal broken but the paper order kept. Her face had gone still in the way faces do when too much has entered, and the body must become a room for it. She rose and carried the letter to the rear door. The alley was brightening toward afternoon. Cloud moved fast above the ridge, letting down and taking back pale shafts of light. Elin stood with her back to the rear door, as Adelaide had instructed, though sunset was still far off. The black walnut leaned over the retaining wall, its bark ridged and dark, its bare branches reaching across the alley like a hand that had forgotten whether it meant to bless or hold back. She waited. The sun came through a broken place between roofs and touched a patch of iron, half swallowed by bark. At first it looked like only another scar in the trunk. Then she saw the curve, a horseshoe set long ago and taken in slowly by the tree's growing body. The ends of it disappeared beneath bark, but the arc remained visible, rust dark and patient, cupping the light. Elin crossed the alley carefully and climbed the little rise behind the wall where roots had lifted the soil. Beneath the horseshoe at the base of the tree, the earth held small fragments that might have been stone until she knelt and brushed them clean. Metal, comb teeth, broken, filed, tarnished green in places, some no longer than a fingernail clipping, some wide enough to show the clean line where they had snapped. They had been buried and uncovered by weather, then buried again by leaves, failed music near roots. She did not dig. She only pressed the soil back where her fingers had disturbed it. Inside, she searched the high shelf above the south bench and found a box of candle ends wrapped in newspaper from 1963. Most had bent with heat and time. One, longer than the rest, was ivory-coloured, its wick blackened but not spent. The wax smelled faintly of bees and dust. A note in pencil on the paper read Mrs. Vale's altar candle, "Do not discard," which meant someone after Adelaide had known enough to keep one ordinary light from being thrown away. Elin set the candle in an iron holder near the bird and lit it from the stove flame. The wick took slowly, first a blue bead, then yellow, then a narrow steady flame that leaned whenever air entered under the door. It lit the breast of the great Ozark thrush, catching the faded feathers one by one until green returned in hidden places. It lit the tools laid on the bench. It lit the envelope. It lit the blue pill box open now, with August's brass pin and broken comb teeth resting inside like tiny witnesses. She stood there until wax softened at the candle's shoulder. After a while, the names of those who had carried her to this room came forward, not as a lesson but as a procession of small mercies, the Berryville librarian cutting the notice from the paper with careful scissors and writing the address across the envelope, the bus driver who told her the road distance without mockery, the farmer near Van Buren who pointed her away before calling anyone official, Martha Klein at the counter placing the repair review form beside the deed and not calling it charity, Silas Pritchard writing her name into a ledger with no proof except her answer, even the woman at the bakery holding the side door open 1 second longer than necessary had given warmth without witness. None of them had saved her. That was not the shape of it. They had each opened one narrow door and then allowed her the dignity of walking through. If you are watching tonight from a warm room or a truck cab or a hospital chair or the far end of a long day, you may know the kind of kindness that does not announce itself. Perhaps someone once paid for your coffee when your hands were empty. Perhaps a neighbour cleared snow from your steps and never mentioned it. Perhaps a nurse placed one extra blanket over your feet, or a clerk gave you directions slowly because she saw you were close to breaking. Tell us, if you can, about one small kindness you received and never forgot. These are the quiet hinges on which whole lives sometimes turn. The candle burned lower. Elin made no plan for the money that day. She did not imagine new clothes, a rented room, a bus away from the hills, or any triumphant settling of accounts. The hospital debt existed. The county fines existed. The roof, the chimney, the wall, the windows, all waited with the frank demands of physical things, but the letter had placed them in order. Eat before repair, make safe before tune, pay what keeps wolves from the door, do not mistake money for inheritance. She put the banknotes back in their packets. She returned the coins to their envelopes. She wrapped the medal again in its cloth, touching only the edges. She laid the music rolls in a long drawer lined with clean paper from Silas's wrapping. The tools she arranged on the bench according to use, not beauty. The letter she placed beneath the blue pillbox, weighed by the bent awl. Before dark she walked once more to the walnut tree. She did not speak to it. There are things older than our need to explain ourselves. She stood near the buried comb teeth until the cold moved through her shoes, then returned inside and barred the rear door with the board she had pried loose the day she arrived. That night she slept beside the heirlooms, not on top of them, not clutching them, but near enough that if someone opened the door she would wake before they crossed the room. The tin box sat under the bench within reach. The letter lay inside her coat, against the place where the library envelope had ridden through rain and road and hay dust. The medal rested near the blue pillbox. The great Ozark thrush stood in the dimness, rear panel open, no longer guarding its secret, not yet restored to song. The fire gave one last red pulse beneath the ash. The first snow came on December 6th, 6 inches by the cafe window thermometer, and it showed Elin exactly where the roof had failed. By morning the workshop wore white on every surface except the west edge, where heatless air moved through the broken tin and kept a dark, wet seam visible from the alley. Snow melted there first, entered beneath a patch of tar, and found its way down the inside wall in 3 deliberate lines. One fell into the cracked bowl she had set beneath the sill. One ran behind the customer counter. The third touched the floor near the front door and spread into a stain shaped like a hand. She did not climb that day. She read. The Blue Manual's roof chapter was only 9 pages long, but she read it 3 times beside the stove, sounding out the terms until they ceased being instructions and became order. Rafter, sister, decking, underlayment, drip edge, course, exposure, flashing. She copied the roof diagram into the back of her ledger and measured the building from inside first, because the outside stairs remained slick with ice. 12 feet 2 inches across the narrow side, 31 feet from rear wall to front wall, not counting the slight overhang. A slope that made estimating difficult from below but not impossible. She added waste, because Silas had written in the margin of her supply list, a roof punishes optimism. The calculation came to 4 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles if she replaced only the west slope, 5 if the ridge proved rotten, 1 roll of 15-pound felt, 2 pounds of 1 1/4 inch roofing nails, 4 lengths of drip edge, used if available, 1 strip of step flashing near the crooked chimney, though Silas warned her that flashing a chimney whose mortar had not yet been repointed was like sewing lace onto a sack of flour. You fix the worst first, he said, not the whole world. He had set the materials aside behind the stove at Pritchard Hardware. The shingles were mismatched remnants from 3 jobs, dark grey, green-black, and 1 bundle closer to brown, but all sound. The felt roll had water stains on the outer wrap and clean paper inside. The nails came in a coffee can marked by weight. The drip edge had old paint on it and screw holes from another roof. The total went onto the ledger. Elin copied it into hers. Before she left, Silas reached beneath the counter and brought up a roofing hatchet with a hickory handle polished smooth by use. The blade was dark and clean, the gauge worn but readable, the hammer pole scarred from 1,000 strikes. A strip of tape near the handle carried the name Pritchard in block letters. "My brother Owen's," he said. Elin did not reach for it. "I cannot buy that. Did not offer to sell. I should not borrow family tools. Most tools worth using are family tools, whether blood admits it or not." He laid it across the shingles. Owen roofed half the county before his knees quit. He died 8 years back. If that hatchet stays under my counter much longer, it will forget what rain sounds like. She carried it back, wrapped in burlap, with the hatchet under one arm and the coffee can of nails against her ribs. The elder roofer arrived the next morning without invitation. He was waiting in the alley when she opened the rear door, a narrow man in a tan work coat, with a knitted cap pulled low and a carpenter's pencil behind one ear. His beard was white, trimmed short, and his eyes were almost hidden under heavy lids that made him look half asleep until he examined the roofline. Then nothing about him slept. "Silas sent me," he said. Elin tightened her hand on the doorframe. "I cannot pay another account. Did not ask. I have to say that first." "Good. You said it." He looked up again. "Name's Amos Rudd. I roofed before shingles got thin, and men got proud." He would not come inside for coffee because she had none to offer, and because, he said, roofs did not improve while men warmed themselves talking about them. He tested the stairs, cursed only once, and climbed with a rope looped around his waist while Elin held the other end from the landing. He moved slowly, but not uncertainly. Every placement of boot and hand had been decided before his weight shifted. That nail's proud. Pull it. Line wandered. Snap it again. Do not chase crooked. Let the roof tell you. The west rafter nearest the chimney had softened where water had followed the brick down for years. Amos showed her how to sister it, cut a sound length to match the old line, slide it tight against the damaged member, clamp if clamps existed, wedge if they did not, then fasten with staggered screws so the repair shared load rather than merely pretending to. They had no new lumber long enough, so Silas found a salvaged 2x6 from a torn porch, dense old pine with nail scars and one blackened end. Amos made her plane the edge true before it went up. "Wood remembers insult," he said. "Do not add yours." They stripped the worst tin patch by patch. Under it, the roof deck showed places of rot and places of surprising strength. Elin learned the feel of a board that could be trusted under a knee. She learned to keep 3 points of contact, to place nails in her apron mouth up so she could find them without looking, to strike with a hatchet's pole in 3 clean strokes rather than 6 anxious taps. First stroke to set, second to drive, third to seat, never bruise. 3, Amos said. She struck 4. He looked at her. She pulled the nail and did it again. By the 5th day, her palms had opened at the base of 2 fingers. By the 7th, the skin hardened. By the 9th, she could snap a chalk line alone, holding one end under the head of a temporary nail while drawing the chord taut enough to sing. The blue chalk left a straight mark across mismatched shingles, and for once the workshop gained a line no one could call accidental. Neighbours watched from porches without offering advice. Roscoe barked the first morning, then accepted the work as part of his district. The man with the kindling walked past twice carrying split wood and looked up without comment. On the 10th day, the bakery woman left 2 rolls wrapped in paper on the lower step. Amos ate 1 in 3 bites and said nothing about who had placed them there. They finished the west slope on December 17th, just before the light failed. The shingles did not match, and the ridge still leaned, and the chimney flashing waited for better mortar. But the dark seam at the west edge was gone. Felt lay beneath. Drip edge held. The patched sign was removed from the roof and set against the wall, where its old painted letters, almost unreadable, turned out to say Fresh Catfish Fridays from some vanished cafe. Amos stood in the alley and studied the roof. "Will shed water," he said. It was praise enough to warm the hands. January did not arrive with ceremony. It settled into the brick. The chimney that had drawn smoke well enough for survival now showed its deeper damage under the new discipline of the roof. Without constant water running down the west wall, the bricks dried, and drying revealed what damp had hidden. Spalling had eaten the outer faces of 5 courses above the firebox and 3 near the roofline. The mortar between them had powdered to the colour of stale flour. If Elin touched one joint with the awl, grains fell without resistance. She carried a sample to Silas in a folded envelope. He tipped it onto the counter, rubbed it between thumb and finger, and made a sound in his throat. "Portland patch over old lime," he said. "Somebody made it worse in 1960-something. How do I make it better?" Slowly. He drew a ratio on brown paper, 2 parts sharp sand screened, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fireclay for the inner joints near the firebox, less above the smoke shelf, no straight Portland cement against old brick unless she wanted the bricks to surrender around the patch. Dampen the joints first, pack deep, tool the face after thumbprint set, not while wet and shining, protect from hard freeze. Mortar cures, Silas said. It does not dry like laundry. For 3 weeks she worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s. Some mornings the public spigot wore a collar of ice, and she had to wrap the handle in cloth before turning it. She warmed small amounts of water inside, because cold water made poor mortar and numbed fingers faster. The lime came in a torn sack Silas sold at half price because one corner had hardened. The fireclay was in a coffee tin. The sand came from a pile behind the hardware store, shoveled into 2 feed sacks and carried uphill in separate trips. The first job was raking out the failed joints. She used a narrow chisel, the awl, and a stiff brush, removing powdered mortar to a depth twice the joint width, just as the manual instructed. It felt destructive until she learned the sound of sound mortar beneath. Bad joints whispered and crumbled. Good joints answered with a dry resistance. She worked by that distinction inch after inch. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. She kept count because count gave shape to endurance. 15 minutes of raking, 5 minutes at the stove with fingers held near the heat, not too close, because cold skin burned before it warmed. 15 minutes of brushing dust from joints, 5 minutes warming, 15 minutes mixing a batch no larger than she could place before it stiffened, 5 minutes breathing into her gloves, flexing each finger until pain returned like a narrow mercy. At night, lime dried pale in the cracks of her knuckles. She washed but could not remove all of it. Her hands began to look like the hands of someone older and more certain. The inner firebox demanded the most careful work. She packed the fireclay mix deep into the joints with the thin edge of a scrap shingle, pressing until no hollow remained. The bricks had shifted slightly at the back, so she shimmed one with a wetted sliver of old brick and filled around it in 2 passes rather than forcing the line true at once. A false straightness, the manual warned, could make a firebox shed its repair after heat expansion. Honest crookedness, properly supported, lasted longer. Amos came once during the chimney work, stood with his hands in his pockets, and watched her tool a joint. Too wet, she lifted the trowel. Wait, wait. He stood there in silence for 7 minutes. Then he touched the mortar with his thumb and nodded. Now, that was the whole lesson. The upper chimney required no climbing onto the roof at first. She worked from the attic crawl, reaching through a broken panel where brick passed the rafters, clearing debris, repacking joints, brushing soot feathers from places no one had looked at in decades. Later, Amos tied a rope around the chimney base and showed her how to work from the ladder 1 course at a time, never leaning past her belt, never trusting a rung because it had held the previous minute. On January 28th, after 2 days of cure and 1 morning of pale sun, she made the test fire. She used dry kindling, 1 newspaper twist, and 3 small sticks Silas had given her from a crate marked applewood. The flame caught low and blue, then yellow. Smoke rose into the flue without hesitation. She fed the fire slowly, listening to the chimney. No cough, no backdraft, no bitter roll into the room. Outside, she stood in the alley and looked up. The smoke went clean. A thin line, straight at first, then torn by wind above the roof, but clean. She watched until the sticks burned through. Then she went inside and placed 1 hand against the chimney breast, where warmth moved through brick that had been broken, emptied, packed, and given time. The heat did not roar. It held. The floors could not be repaired all at once because the room still had to be lived in. That was the first lesson. Restoration, for people without spare houses, must proceed in islands. A square cleared near the chimney, a path to the rear door, a bench protected by cloth, a corner for tools. Everything else shifted from one side to the other in the slow, ridiculous choreography of survival. Elin stacked drawers on the counter, moved music rolls to the safest shelf, wrapped the medal and letter in oilcloth, then swept, knelt and examined the boards one by one. The floor was white pine, old growth by the tightness of its grain, laid in planks of no consistent width. Some were 8 inches, some 10, one nearly 12. They had been fastened with hand-cut rosehead nails, the heads dark and irregular, each one like a small hammered flower. Replacing the floor would have been faster for someone with money and less conscience. Saving it required patience, punch, and knees willing to ache. Silas rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, though he argued with himself aloud before allowing it. Machine saves time, he said. Machine also ruins floors when held by hurry. I can scrape instead. You could. And finish when you are 40. He sent 3 sanding discs with her, 80, 120, and 220 grit. The coarsest was to remove raised grime and old finish, not to flatten history. The middle would quiet the scratches. The finest would smooth without erasing the saw marks near the wall. He made her repeat the sequence back. 80, 120, 220, and keep it moving, and do not chase stains through the floor, and return it clean. She began in the front room where customers had once stood. First she set every nail head below the surface with a nail set and the roofing hatchet, tapping carefully so the sander would not catch metal. Some nails resisted, some sank with a sigh into wood that had held them more than a century. She marked the worst gaps with slips of paper and filled them later with pine slivers shaved to fit, tapped in with hide glue warmed in a tin cup near the stove. The 80 grit pass was loud enough to drive thought from the room. The sander bucked at first, pulling toward grain changes and old ridges. Elin held it with both hands and let the machine's weight do most of the work. Dust rose in pale clouds, filling the window light and settling on her hair, eyelashes, collar, ledger, tools, and the great bird's covered shoulders. She stopped often to sweep because hidden grit under the sander could scar a board worse than age ever had. Under the grey, the wood emerged dark honey. Not new, not pale, honey deepened by smoke, shoes, oil, winter damp, and the long pressure of work. The 120 grit pass softened the surface without stealing its unevenness. The 220 made it warm to the palm. Near the counter, where feet had turned for decades, the pine had worn almost silky. Near the back bench, tiny black marks remained where hot metal or fallen pins had touched it. She left them. A shop floor should not pretend no one had worked. The oil was a mixture Silas recommended because the planks were thirsty. 2 coats thinned tung oil, then 1 finish coat with boiled linseed oil blended in a small amount for warmth, each wiped thin and allowed 48 hours to cure. He warned her about oily rags catching fire if crumpled, so she spread each rag flat over the alley railing until stiff, then stored them in a metal can. Nothing in the shop was allowed to burn by carelessness. The first coat disappeared almost at once. The second stayed longer, darkening the honey toward amber. By the third, in the back room where shadows were deeper, the colour moved toward mahogany around the old benches. The grain rose and settled. Nail heads gleamed faintly like small dark stars. When she walked barefoot for the first time across the cured section, the floor felt not smooth, but awake. There was one bad morning. It came after 3 days of sanding, oiling, moving, waiting, and sleeping in a smaller and smaller clean space between stacks of saved things. She woke before daylight with her hands swollen and her shoulders stiff enough that lifting the water bottle made her breath catch. The fire had died. The room smelled of oil, ash, and wet wool. Outside, sleet tapped the rear door. She looked at the next unsanded section, at the rental sander due back by evening, at the ledger of debt, at the row of tools that had belonged to hands steadier than hers, and she sat down on the floor without meaning to. She stayed there a long time. Then she put on her coat and walked. Not to the hardware store, not to the public spigot. She walked down through town and out toward a marshy place beyond the lower road, where winter water gathered among reeds and dull grass. The sky was low, the ground sucked at her shoes. She found a fallen log and sat there with her hands in her sleeves while a great blue heron stood in the shallows, one leg lifted, head drawn close to its body against the cold. The heron did nothing for nearly 20 minutes. Elin did nothing with it. Once, the bird lowered its foot into the water so slowly the motion seemed like thought made visible. It struck at something beneath the surface, missed, and returned to stillness without complaint. No shame, no explanation, no hurry to prove itself useful. Elin did not work that day. She returned the sander late, cleaned, and Silas charged her for only 1 day, though both of them knew the clock had gone beyond that. He wrote the amount in the ledger and did not look up. "Floor still there tomorrow," he said. "Yes, sir. Most things are, if they are worth saving." By February, light had become the next repair. The workshop had 8 windows if one counted the small rear sash above the door and the high fixed pane near the chimney. 3 had no glass at all, only boards or cardboard held in place by brittle tape. 4 were cracked in branching lines that made every view of the town seem underwater. 1 pane, in the upper front sash, was original cylinder glass, wavy and faintly green at the edge, with a tiny bubble trapped near the corner. Silas said it might date to the first construction of the room, though the shop sign came later. Amos, passing through while returning a borrowed ladder, looked at it and said only, "Do not break that." She did not. Window work was slower than she expected because glass was less forgiving than wood and more honest than plaster. A board could be coaxed. A pane either held or became pieces. She began by removing sash from the 3 easiest frames, marking each with pencil so it would return to the same opening. The ropes in the old double-hung windows had frayed to powder behind the side trim. Counterweights waited in their pockets like iron loaves, still doing their duty after all those years, though no cord remained to answer them. Silas sold her 1/4-inch cotton sash cord from a bin that smelled of wax and hemp, along with glazier's points, a small tub of DAP 33 glazing putty, and 2 panes of salvaged glass cut from storm windows. The 3rd missing pane required new glass, and she wrote its higher cost with a tighter hand in her ledger. The putty had to be kneaded until pliable. In the cold, this meant holding it near the stove in a paper wrapper, then working it between palms until it yielded. Too cold and it tore, too warm and it smeared. She scraped old glazing with the awl and a borrowed putty knife, careful not to gouge the wood. Some rabbits were dry and thirsty, so she primed them lightly before bedding the glass. Set a thin line of putty first, press the pane gently. Glazier's points in with the putty knife, not a hammer unless she wanted a lesson in regret. Then the face putty, angled clean to shed water, corners mitered with a patience she did not possess at first, but learned by failing in small amounts. Her first putty line looked like a rope dropped by a child. She scraped it off and began again. The sash cord was a different kind of puzzle. She opened the weight pocket, tied the new cotton cord to the counterweight with a figure-8 knot, tested it twice, then fed it over the pulley. The first knot slipped because she had tied it too near the frayed end. The counterweight dropped inside the wall with a heavy hidden thud that made her close her eyes. Silas, when she told him, handed her a long magnet on a string. Everyone drops one. You? Everyone honest. By the 4th window her hands understood the rhythm, cord over pulley, weight tied with a figure-8, dressed flat, tail long enough to trust, sash lifted into the track, not seated in the side groove, trim returned with nails saved and straightened, test lift, listen. If the weight knocked, adjust. If the sash crept down, the cord was wrong or the window was telling the truth about its own imbalance. The cracked panes she did not replace all at once. 2 cracks were tight and stable enough to wait. 1 had to be changed because wind entered through it in a line sharp enough to move candle flame from 6 feet away. The smallest rear pane she patched temporarily with glass from a broken picture frame found under the counter, bedding it carefully even though it was not the right thickness. Temporary work, Silas had warned, should still be done as if one had to look at it in daylight. The original pane remained until last. She cleaned around it with warm water and a cloth so soft it was nearly threadbare. The old glass distorted the world beyond in gentle waves. Through it, the alley railing bent and straightened when she moved her head. Roscoe's porch seemed to float. The walnut branches crossed the sky in lines that looked drawn by hand. She reglazed that pane without removing it, working in small sections, leaving every old point she could preserve, touching the glass only at the edges. On the afternoon she finished, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside the front window. It was close enough that she could see the small black cap, the pale cheek, the restless precision of its feet against bark. It turned its head once toward the room, then toward the street, then back toward her. Behind it, winter light entered through glass that no longer rattled in its frame. The shop seemed to take the light differently now. Not brighter in any grand sense, more evenly, more honestly. Elin stood with the putty knife in her hand and did not move until the bird flew. When it did, the sash held, the glass held, the room held its breath and released it slowly. By late February, the walls began asking for their share. They had been patient through the roof, the chimney, the floors and the windows, but patience was not the same as soundness. Once the room held steady heat, and the worst damp no longer entered freely. 3 failed patches near the chimney declared themselves. One sagged outward in a grey belly above the hearth. One had cracked in a map of fine lines near the back bench. The third, behind the shelf of brass cylinders, had separated from its lath so completely that when Elin tapped it with 2 fingers, it answered hollow as an empty box. The plaster was older than the repairs around it. Horsehair plaster on hand-split oak lath, the kind laid by men who mixed by eye and learned by wrist. When she removed the first failed patch, she found the lath beneath still dark, thin and uneven, split rather than sawn, each strip nailed with small cut nails that had rusted but not released. Horsehair showed in the broken plaster like blackened chestnut threads, holding the old lime together long after it had ceased trusting the wall. Silas came by after closing with a paper sack. Not large, folded twice at the top. "My father kept this," he said. From the old place on Pivot Rock Road. 1950s, maybe earlier. Inside was horsehair, clean and dry, tied in a cord. He had also sent a note with ratios written in his square hand. Lime putty, sharp sand, hair teased loose, enough water to make it cling without slumping. Scratch coat first, pressed through lath and scored while damp. Brown coat 3/8 inch after the first took hold, cure 72 hours if the room stayed above freezing. Finish coat 1/8 inch, lime and finer sand, worked smooth but not polished. "Do not make it pretty," Silas said. "I thought finish plaster was supposed to be smooth." "Smooth, yes. Proud. No. Wall's been standing longer than us. Let it keep its face." She covered the floor with salvaged paper and moved the cylinders away from the dust. The failed plaster came off in handfuls, then in flat pieces, then in crumbs. She saved a fragment showing the old layers and set it on the bench as a sample, because the past deserved witnesses even when it fell apart. The lath she brushed, dampened, and left to drink. The scratch coat was rough labour. She pushed the plaster through the gaps until it mushroomed behind the lath, forming keys that would hold the wall from the unseen side. Then she scored the surface with a broken comb of nails set in scrapwood, making horizontal grooves for the next coat. Her arms shook by the end. Lime dotted her sleeves and dried pale across one cheek. The brown coat came 3 days later, measured close to 3/8 inch with a little notched stick she made from cedar. It wanted to sag near the chimney where the old wall leaned, so she applied it in 2 passes and waited between them, warming the room not too quickly. Fast heat could crack new plaster before it learned the shape of the wall. The final coat was thinner, 1/8 inch, made with finer sand and worked in long strokes that followed the room rather than correcting it. When the last patch had taken its set, she stood back. The repairs did not disappear. They were visible if one knew how to look, softer in colour, faintly different in texture, and that was right. The wall did not need to lie. It needed to hold. "These patches will hold another 100 years, she said. The words surprised her by sounding less like hope than instruction. Doris Bellamy owned the Basin Cup Cafe and ran it with the gravity of a woman who believed toast could be either a kindness or an insult. depending on whether it arrived warm. She was stout, broad-shouldered, and always moving, with red reading glasses perched on top of her head and a pencil tucked behind her ear, though she never seemed to write with it. Her hair, once black, had gone silver in a thick streak above her left temple. She wore white aprons over dark dresses and called everyone by the name they gave her, never shortening it unless invited. The cafe smelled of coffee, fried potatoes, yeast rolls, and lemon cleaner before 7 in the morning, and of soup, wet wool, and cinnamon by noon. Elin first found the paper bags on the workshop's rear step after the roofwork began. One held 2 biscuits wrapped in wax paper, a boiled egg, and an apple with a bruise cut out so neatly the missing place looked intentional. The second time, there was soup in a jar, still warm beneath a towel. The third time, beans, cornbread, and a folded note that said jar back when able. Elin carried the jar to the cafe the next morning, washed, with 2 coins taped to the lid. Doris removed the coins and pushed them back across the counter. No, I need to pay. You need to eat. I have an account already at the hardware. This is not hardware. I cannot take food for nothing. Doris leaned both palms on the counter, and the whole cafe seemed to respect the gesture. Then pay me in candles when the shop reopens. Elin looked down at the coins. I do not make candles. You might learn. That could take a while. Doris nodded toward the street, toward the hill, toward the winter that had not yet finished with any of them. I have waited longer for less. After that, the bags continued, not daily, not predictably, never enough to make Elin feel owned by them. Some mornings there was nothing. Some evenings there was a heel of bread, 2 carrots, a jar of stew, or coffee grounds wrapped in paper with instructions for boiling. Doris never mentioned the bags when Elin passed the cafe window. She only lifted one hand and went back to her griddle. Caleb Pike arrived by bicycle, though the hill made that seem a poor decision. The bicycle was a blue Schwinn with 1 white wall tire and a front basket wired in 2 places. Caleb was 15 or 16, long-legged and narrow as a fence rail, with hair falling into his eyes and a seriousness too large for his face. He wore a canvas jacket with sleeves short at the wrist and carried a splitting maul across his handlebars as if it were a musical instrument he had been forced to learn. He appeared on a Saturday morning while Elin was sorting scrap wood behind the lower wall. My mother said, he began. Then he stopped, because the rest embarrassed him. Elin waited. My mother said you needed wood split. I do, but I cannot pay for help. He looked offended. But quietly, I did not ask. I have to say that first. My mother said you would. He set them all down and began splitting the larger pieces Silas had let her take from a demolition pile. His first swing glanced off and stuck in the chopping block. His second split a piece cleanly. By the 10th sweat had darkened his collar, though the air held near freezing. Elin stacked while he split, and for a while the sound of the maul shaped the morning. After half an hour, she said, Who is your mother? Ruth Pike. Works at the clinic desk. Ellen's hands stilled. Caleb noticed, but only wiped his nose on his sleeve and added, she said, about your grandfather. He was not my grandfather. My mother said the way people mean things is sometimes close enough. He split another round. She had a little music box. Rabbit on top. Stopped when she was 9. He fixed it and would not take money because her daddy had just died. Said children need at least one thing that keeps playing. The maul rose and fell. She still has it. Elin bent to pick up 2 split pieces, using the motion to cover the time it took to breathe evenly. Caleb came twice a week after that when weather allowed. He split wood, hauled water, carried broken plaster to the dump pile, and once helped lift a workbench just long enough for Elin to slide a shim under one leg. He would not accept coins. He would accept biscuits if Doris had sent extra, and once he accepted the right to turn the great Ozark thrush's empty crank 1/4 inch, while Elin watched the linkage beneath the wing. Does it sing? He asked. Not yet. He nodded, satisfied by the word yet. Reverend Boyd did not enter the shop until April. but his presence belonged to the rebuild long before that. He was a tall black man in his 70s, with a camel overcoat brushed thin at the cuffs and a brown felt hat he tipped to everyone from bank president to stray cat. He walked past the rear alley every morning at nearly the same hour, coming down from a white church tucked above the curve of Spring Street. His steps were slow, not weak. He carried a Bible in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, and when rain fell he placed the newspaper under the Bible rather than the other way around. The first morning, he paused at the gate, tipped his hat, and said, "Peace on your hands." 4 words, then he went on. The next morning, the same. The third, he added nothing. He did not ask what she was doing, where she had come from, whether she had people, whether she prayed, whether she required saving in any direction. He walked past, tipped his hat, and left 4 words behind like kindling too small to call a gift. Peace on your hands. In March, when Elin cut her thumb on old glass and came out to rinse blood beneath the spigot, he happened to be passing. He stopped at the alley mouth, saw the rag around her hand, and waited. Deep, no, sir. Clean, I think so. He nodded and removed a wrapped bandage from his coat pocket. The kind people carry when age has taught them that the body is a sudden thing. He placed it on the stone wall between them. Peace on your hands, he said again. Then he continued down the hill. Newspaper under Bible, hat brim darkened by fog. Elin postponed the cellar until February 11th. She knew the date because she wrote it in the ledger beside 3 words, no more avoiding. It was not the labour she had feared, though labour was part of it. It was the thought of what lay below. Houses built into hills often kept their oldest truths underground, where damp, stone, roots and darkness had time to speak among themselves. The workshop had already given more than anyone could receive easily. Another door felt like too much. The cellar hatch was beneath the rear workbench, partly hidden by a mat of curled oilcloth and a stack of broken drawers. The ring handle had rusted flat against the planks. She worked it loose with oil, patience, and the thin end of the roofing hatchet then lifted. Cold air rose from below, mineral damp, and older than the rooms above. 7 granite steps led down, each worn in the middle by feet long gone. She counted them aloud without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The walls were fieldstone, rough and close, beaded with moisture where the earth pressed near. The cellar floor measured 12 feet by 15 feet when she paced it later, but at first it seemed larger because the lantern light did not reach the corners cleanly. Empty shelves lined the north wall. Along the south lay 3 stoneware crocks, one cracked through, one holding only dust, one sealed with a lid so tight she left it undisturbed after testing. At the centre of the floor sat a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the fieldstone around it. The slab was rectangular, smoothed on top, and fitted so neatly into the floor that its edges showed only as dark lines. In its centre was a carved craft mark, a bird's open beak above a toothed comb, the two joined by a small rising note. The carving had filled with dust, but when Elin brushed it clean, the mark appeared with startling clarity. The slab had an iron-lifting ring at one end. She did not touch it. Leave sealed what is not yet asking to be opened. Adelaide's instruction returned with such steadiness that Elin set the brush down and stepped back. The slab was not for winter, not for hunger, not for a body still learning the upper room. It could keep its silence. On the stairs going up, her lantern caught something wedged beneath the 3rd step. A small oak box, darkened by damp but not rotted, had been pushed back against the riser, where it would be missed by anyone descending in haste. She knelt on the 4th step and worked it free. The lid had no lock, only a brass clasp shaped like a tiny folded wing. Inside lay a key and a photograph. The key was brass, longer than a door key and finer in the stem. Its bow shaped like the same mark carved on the slab, bird comb rising note. The metal had tarnished dark in the hollows where fingers had not touched it. Beside it lay a tin-type photograph in a paper sleeve. silvered at the edges but clear enough that Elin forgot the cold air around her. A young woman stood in front of the workshop before the sign had weathered, before the railing had rusted, before the walnut had swallowed the horseshoe so deeply. She was about 25, with dark hair pinned back and a work apron over her dress. In one hand she held a comb lifter, in the other a small bird body not yet feathered. Her face was not Elin's face, not exactly. Time alters every mirror, but the set of the mouth, the length of the fingers, the inward focus around the eyes, all of it struck so close that Elin sat down on the cellar step. The back of the photograph bore a line in brown ink. Ruth Bell Ormand, daughter of Elias Ormand, age 25, summer of 1903. Not proof in any ordinary sense. No courthouse would open its books for a resemblance held in lantern light, yet the photograph had the sober authority of physical things. The woman stood where Elin now lived. She held the tool of the trade. She looked toward the camera as if interrupted from work she expected to return to. Elin carried the box upstairs and set the photograph beside Adelaide's letter. The brass key she placed on the mantel, not hidden, not used, not worn on a string. It rested there through the rest of February and all of March, catching firelight along its bird-shaped bow. She did not yet know what it opened. The room had waited, quiet and patient, keeping what had been forgotten. Spring did not come all at once to the Ozarks. It loosened one knot at a time. The snow retreated first from the south-facing walls, leaving the shaded steps slick for another week. Then the creek below town grew loud with snowmelt, talking over stones day and night until even the workshop seemed to have running water in its streams. Walnut catkins appeared like green-brown tassels from bare branches. Moss brightened in the stone joints. The air changed in the mornings, not warm yet, but no longer closed against the skin. Elin opened the front room for an hour each dry afternoon. Not to customers. There were none. She opened it because rooms that have been shut too long need to practice receiving air. Dust moved out, light moved in. The old bell above the front door, freed from cobweb and cleaned of rust, gave one faint note the first time wind touched it. Not a ring, a reminder. People began to pause on the lower street. Some looked up at the sign, some read the red notice still nailed beside the door, and then looked at the repaired roof, the glazed windows, the swept sill, unsure which authority to believe. Martha Klein passed once on her way from the courthouse and said nothing about the notice. 2 days later, a man from planning came with a clipboard, looked at the roof, chimney, rear stairs and windows, and wrote visible stabilization documented on his form. He did not smile, but he removed one page from the violation packet and folded it into his pocket. Elin did not begin the craft that spring. This decision cost her more than she admitted aloud. The tools waited, the rolls waited. The great Ozark thrush stood under a lighter cloth now, its damaged wing marked with thread where repairs would one day begin. Some mornings she wanted to lift the combs, cut leather, warm glue, and make one thing sing if only to prove the room had not mistaken her, but wanting was not readiness. She could repair a roof under instruction, clean a chimney, oil a floor, mend plaster, glaze windows. The bird required another kind of steadiness. She chose small samples, with one coin from the envelope, a worn mercury dime already loose from its paper. She ordered practice materials through Silas, scrap brass, 3 gauges of pin wire, a small square of bellows leather, paper with enough rag to punch cleanly, and 2 comb blanks, too flawed for finished work, but good enough for learning. She recorded the coin in the ledger, not by collector worth, but by its departure from the others. 1 dime spent for practice, March 19th. At night she sat at the bench and worked on pieces that did not matter, filing a tooth too far, learning the sound of too much pressure, punching holes that tore because she hurried, cutting leather that buckled because the hinge cloth was not on the bias. Each failure stayed on the bench until she understood it, then went into a small jar labelled "Not Yet." The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished piece sat on the front counter beneath the green-shaded lamp. It was not the great Ozark thrush. That bird still stood in the back room, partially repaired, its bellows renewed, one wing rebuilt in brass and feather, but not yet tuned for public breath. Elin had learned enough by then to know that the largest inheritance should not be used to prove the speed of the inheritor. The first completed piece was modest, a walnut music box no wider than a loaf pan, built from salvaged wood found in the cellar shelves, with a small cylinder she had pinned by hand, and a comb she had tuned over 6 careful weeks. The song was not famous. It was one of Adelaide's studies, Lullaby for June Rain, simplified where the original asked for a bird valve the box did not have. The melody moved slowly, rising by thirds, pausing in a way that let the room hear the next note before it arrived. The box had no ornament except a small inlaid arc of brass on the lid, shaped like the horseshoe in the walnut. Inside the lid, Elin had written in ink, Ormand Vale Study No. 1, Repaired Room, Winter 2024. She wound it only halfway the first morning. The spring took, the governor settled, the cylinder turned, pins lifted teeth in their exact order, and the first note stepped into the room like a person entering a house respectfully. Then the next, then the next. The sound was not large. It did not fill the town, summon witnesses, or declare a victory. It crossed the counter, touched the restored floor, rose toward the reglazed window and remained. Elin stood with both hands flat on the counter until the tune ended. The restored interior had become neither museum nor parlour. It was still a working room, which meant it was allowed to show use. The front counter had been cleaned and repaired, but the crack in the glass case remained visible at one corner, joined with a fine brass brace Caleb had filed under her instruction. The shelves held finished repairs on the left and waiting repairs on the right, each tagged with date, owner and condition. The floor glowed dark honey where feet passed most often. The plaster patches had cured to a soft chalk white that caught morning light differently from the older wall. The chimney drew faithfully, the windows lifted on cotton cord and held their place. The back room smelled of beeswax, oil, wood dust, warmed glue, and old paper that had been given dry air again. The great Ozark thrush stood at the far end on its mahogany pedestal, still unfinished but no longer shrouded. Its glass eyes had been cleaned. Its cracked beak had been stabilized, not replaced. The missing wing feather had been mended with one from Adelaide's packet, dark green until light struck it and revealed gold. On the bench nearby lay practice rolls, patterns, tools, and Elin's own notes, written with the same exactness August had taught and Adelaide had confirmed. The brass key on the mantel remained unused until the first hard frost of that second winter. It was December 12th, and the morning had come sharp enough to silver the alley stones. Elin had risen early to carry ashes out, and found a line of frost along the walnut-swallowed horseshoe. The iron curve shone against the bark. Above it, where she had looked 100 times without understanding, a narrow brass plate had emerged in the trunk, revealed by a piece of bark that had fallen during the night. She set the ash bucket down. The plate was no larger than her palm, dark with age, partly grown over at the edges. At its centre was not a keyhole in the ordinary sense, but a shaped opening. Bird. Comb. Rising note. The same as the key bow. The same as the cellar slab. The same mark repeated until readiness made it visible. She went inside for the key. It fit without force. The first turn did nothing. She stopped, breathed into her hands, and looked at the horseshoe. Then she turned the key, not right but left, following the curve of the iron. The plate released with a soft click. A small section of the trunk, not living wood but an old fitted plug hidden where a branch had once been cut, moved outward. Inside was a hollow lined with tin. The folded flag came first, cotton, carefully wrapped, its stars arranged in the pattern of 48. The fabric had yellowed but not rotted, and when Elin unfolded one corner indoors later, she could see the blue field still holding its depth. Beneath it lay a note in Adelaide's hand, dated November 11th, 1951, to the keeper of this room. This flag covered Samuel Vale's coffin after the War Department returned what remained to Arkansas soil. I could not keep it in a drawer where moth and damp would make ordinary ruin of it, and I could not place it in the shop where anger might teach me disrespect. The walnut has held grief before. Let it hold this too until someone can remember without being consumed. If you find it, air it gently on a dry day. Do not display it for praise. Do not sell it. Fold it with clean hands. A. O. V. Elin read the note beside the stove while frost softened on the windows. Then she refolded the flag as best she could. Not perfectly, not according to military instruction, but with care enough to know she needed help. She carried it that afternoon to Reverend Boyd, who received it at the church office with both hands. He did not ask how she had come by it until she had finished telling him. Then he called a retired sergeant from the congregation, a woman named Miss Clara Henson, who arrived in 20 minutes wearing house shoes and a winter coat over her apron because some calls outranked appearances. Miss Henson showed Elin how to fold the flag on the long table in the fellowship hall. Triangle over triangle, edges held, stars showing, no speech, only hands. The military medal from the cedar compartment found its public honour on a different day, though public, in this case, meant only 3 people and a quiet hill. On November 11th, 2024, Veterans Day, Elin carried Nathaniel Ormand's medal to Eureka Springs Cemetery, where Martha had helped her locate the family plot after an afternoon among old records. The grave marker was limestone, weathered but legible, Nathaniel Elias Ormand, 1896 to 1921, PVDA US Army. The grass around it had gone brown at the tips. Someone long ago had planted iris there, their leaves cut back by frost. Reverend Boyd came, so did Silas, wearing a dark coat and holding his hat in both hands. Elin placed the medal, still wrapped in its cloth, on the stone for 1 minute, not leaving it to weather, not making a display, only letting the bronze touch the name. Reverend Boyd spoke 4 words, the same words he had given her hands, peace on his rest. Silas cleared his throat once and looked away toward the cedars. Afterward, Elin took the medal home and returned it to the tin box, now stored in a locked drawer built beneath the counter. Some things deserved to be brought into the light and then kept safe from it. The money changed less than people might imagine. It did not become a house on level ground, a motor car, a wardrobe, a newspaper article, or a public tale told with Elin's face at the centre. At first she had paid what had to be paid to keep the wolves from the door, filing fees, back taxes arranged through a hardship schedule, the smallest lawful payments toward medical debt after Silas introduced her to a retired bookkeeper who knew how to demand written accounting from collection offices. Later, after a legal aid volunteer reviewed the Mercy Bridge records, certain debts were contested, reduced, paused, and in one case dismissed, because the paperwork beneath them had been less honest than its letterhead. Carlton Voss did not return to the story. Men like that often vanish into other offices before consequences learn their forwarding address. Elin did not chase him. The work in front of her was enough. Only 3 coins and 2 notes left the cash for the shop itself in those first 2 years. The Mercury dime for practice materials, a worn quarter for rag paper, 1 peace dollar sold through a reputable dealer to pay the final stabilization inspection, and 2 small banknotes exchanged quietly for insurance, and a proper lock after the front room began receiving repairs again. Each departure was recorded in the ledger with date, reason, and witness when possible. The rest remained sealed. Not hidden in fear, and not hoarded in hunger. Sealed for the next one, as Adelaide had written in different words. Elin placed the larger portion in a bank under a trust arrangement. Martha helped her understand line by line. The older coins, medal, letters, and master rolls stayed in cedar and tin, wrapped against damp, catalogued by hand. The money was no longer a miracle, it was stored labour, and stored labour deserved an honest task. The shop reopened by a card on the corkboard at the base and cup. No announcement. No banner. No ribbon. Doris would not have allowed balloons even if Elin had wanted them, which she did not. The card was plain cream stock, written in black ink. Ormand Vale Mechanical Music. Careful repair of music boxes. Small automata. And paper rolls. No rush work. Leave name with Doris. The first week 3 people copied the number and no one called. The second week Ruth Pike brought the rabbit music box August had repaired decades earlier, not because it needed work but because she wanted Elin to see it. The third week, an older couple from Holiday Island brought a cracked disc box wrapped in a quilt. Then a man from Berryville came with a cylinder box that had belonged to his mother. By the end of the second winter, Elin kept a mailing list of 43 names in a school composition book, each written with address, object, condition, and whether the owner wished repair, appraisal, or only preservation advice. She worked slowly. She refused work beyond her skill. She wrote letters explaining what she had done and what she had not done, because August's habit had entered her hand. Children who came with grandparents were invited behind the counter to watch the mechanism if their hands stayed folded. Some adults looked nervous at this. Elin did not. Children needed at least one thing that kept playing. Caleb returned the sign on a cold afternoon near Christmas, carrying it across his bicycle handlebars the way he had once carried the splitting maul. He had grown taller, though not broader, and his sleeves still seemed to lose their argument with his wrists. He leaned the bicycle against the walnut, lifted the covered plank carefully, and brought it into the front room without meeting Ellen's eyes. Doris had followed him up the hill under the pretense of delivering soup. Silas arrived 2 minutes later under the pretense of needing to inspect the stove gasket. Reverend Boyd happened to be walking past, which by then everyone understood as both true and not the whole truth. Caleb set the plank across the counter and removed the cloth. The wood was walnut, not new, likely from a fallen branch of the tree itself, though he did not say so until later. He had carved the letters by hand, deep enough to cast shadows, irregular in the way handwork lives. The old name remained at the front, copied from the weathered sign above the door. Ormand Vale Mechanical Music, Daughters. Elin looked at the last 2 words for a long while. Plural. Not daughter. Not one woman rescued from disappearance by a single hidden box. Daughters. Ruth Bell Ormand, Adelaide Ormand Vale, Lenora Bell, who never worked at the bench but carried the name through poverty and song, Elin herself. Perhaps someone not yet born, not yet hungry, not yet listening from the wrong side of a door. Caleb cleared his throat. I can sand it more. No. There's a chip by the ampersand. I see it. I can fix that. Do not. He nodded, relieved and embarrassed by the same mercy. Silas ran one thumb along a carved letter. Needs oil, Doris said. Needs hanging. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat. Peace on this threshold. 5 words that time. No one corrected him. They hung it on the first dry day after Christmas, below the older sign rather than replacing it. Amos Rudd, who had not been seen on a ladder since spring, appeared with his own level and a pouch of screws, declared the first placement foolish, and moved it 1/2 an inch left. The new walnut darkened under oil. The carved letters caught afternoon light. From the street below, the plural could be read clearly if a person slowed enough. That evening, after everyone had gone, Elin began her own letter. She used Adelaide's bench, August's patched glasses case to weigh the paper, and a fountain pen Martha had given her from the courthouse lost and found after no one claimed it for a year. The great Ozark thrush stood behind her, still not fully tuned, but its bellows could breathe now when gently worked. The walnut music box rested closed on the counter. Snow began outside, light enough that each flake seemed to decide separately where to land. Elin wrote the first words exactly as Adelaide had. My dear one, whoever you are. Then she stopped, because the next sentence had to be earned. She did not know who would read it, a child of no known relation, a woman sleeping behind a station, a careful boy with a bicycle, a nurse who repaired things after midnight, someone with the Bell name, or the Ormand name, or no name that led back through records. The letter could not choose by blood, it had to choose by listening. She began again beneath the first line. If these pages are in your hands, then some hidden part of this room has trusted your patience. I'm writing before I know enough, because waiting until we are finished is one way people leave nothing behind. She wrote about the roof first because shelter comes before song. She wrote about Silas's ledger, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's maul, Reverend Boyd's 4 words, Martha's brass stamp, Amos's chalk line. She wrote that a tool is never just an object if someone has taught another hand how to hold it. She wrote that money can keep a door open but cannot tell you what to do once you're inside. She wrote her mother's name carefully, then August's, then Ruth Bell, Ormand's, then Adelaide's. At midnight. She had filled only 2 pages. That was enough for the first night. She folded nothing. Not yet. The letter was not finished, because neither was she. Outside, Eureka Springs rested along its hill. Windows dark, stone steps glazed with snow, walnut branches holding winter in their angles. The workshop no longer looked abandoned from the street, but neither did it look restored in the polished sense. It looked kept. That was better. A kept place still had work in it. Inside, the fire settled. The music box waited under its closed lid. The unfinished bird stood in the back room. 1 wing whole, 1 wing still marked with thread. The brass key lay in the drawer beside the folded flag note. The cellar slab kept its carved silence below. Some doors had opened. Others had not. A life did not become honest by opening every hidden thing at once. Near dawn, Elin woke in the chair by the bench. The pen still capped in her hand. The candle had burned down into a shallow pool of wax. Snowlight entered through the original green-edged pane and bent softly across the floor. For a moment she listened without naming anything. The chimney's faint drawl, the settling wood, the distant creak, the town not yet awake. Then the walnut music box. Wound the evening before, and perhaps released by a spring that had held 1 tooth too long, gave a single note. Only one. It crossed the room and faded. Elin smiled. Not broadly. Not for anyone watching, but with the small private movement of a person who has heard an answer and does not need to repeat it aloud. An automaton maker's room waits. It has always waited, and in the county clerk's office, in a side compartment of the cash drawer used for odd records and things no one knew where else to put. A $5 bill and 3 soft ones still lay clipped to a yellow audit slip, marked in Martha Klein's careful hand. First payment, received in full,